Okay, it looks like we are streaming live on YouTube now. That's good. We have a handout in the chat that I can save and keep sharing as people pop in more.
Should we wait another minute or two to wait for some more people to return?
Yeah, we can give it another minute or two. You cool with that?
Yeah.
As I'm sharing things on Twitter/X, can I include the handout as
Yeah,
a thing?
go for it. Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah, I've been bad at promoting on Twitter, but thank you for, yeah.
Yeah, no, totally fair. Just wanted to double check to make sure that that was all right to put out into the world.
While we're still waiting, I feel it incumbent on me to share what is happening right now. Can they in focus? Oh no,
Excellent.
there's a real puddle of cats happening. How do I unblur this?
Okay, then. I think we can, as soon as everyone has appreciated the boyos. Boyo breaks are important, though.
Yeah, they're essential.
Okay, but I guess we can proceed to the last talk of today. And for that, we have as a speaker Dr. Nick Clancy. Nick is a postdoctoral research fellow with a joint appointment from the Canada Research Chair on Epistemic Injustice and Agency and the Centre de Recherche en Éthique, and a member of the philosophy department at McGill. They studied for a BA and MPhil in philosophy at the University of Cambridge and later for a Doctor of Philosophy at the University of Oxford under Amir Srinivasan and Rachel Fraser. And today, Nick is here to give a talk with the title, It is Not True That the More You Laugh, the Better You Understand, Bart contra Murdoch. Very excited to hear what you will be telling us. Nick, please go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Kay, for the introduction, and thanks to all the organisers and everyone for coming. It's very fun getting to see all the people from inside my phone and Jen's boyos in particular. Cool. So, yeah, I'm going to give this talk in which I'm going to try to mash two rather disparate figures together. Iris Murdoch, probably somewhat more familiar, and her, well, roughly contemporary, Roland Barthes, who, yeah, I will say a bit more about in a moment. So hopefully you've all got the handout. I included an epigraph because I can't resist. So I'll just read that. So it's a quote from the British psychoanalyst Adam Phillips, and he writes, "Lovers, of course, are notoriously frantic epistemologists, second only to paranoiacs as readers of signs and wonders. But what would falling in love look like if knowledge was not the aim or the result? What would we be doing together if we were not getting to know each other?" So that gives hopefully a sense of some of the thematics I want to explore. So the talk will have sort of 3 sections and then a sort of very brief sort of coda. In the first section, I'll describe a view that Iris Murdoch, or at least some of her contemporary Anglophone followers, subscribe to, on which loving someone involves a certain sort of epistemic project, an attempt to try to understand who they really or most deeply are in some sense. In the second and longest section, I'll then turn to the rather neglected work of Roland Barthes to try to push back on this idea. And then in the third section, I'll consider where this leaves us, where I think the Murdochians might go wrong, and I'll respond to an objection. So that's sort of a picture of the structure of the talk. Great. Okay, so in the last decade or so, there's been a great deal of renewed interest within sort of analytic Anglophone philosophy in the work of Iris Murdoch, and in particular in what she had to say about love, and mostly in what she had to say about love in her book, The Sovereignty of Good from 1970. And what Murdoch has to say centers on this case involving a mother-in-law, M, and her new daughter-in-law, D. And when M first meets this new daughter-in-law, she's pretty unimpressed. The way Murdoch puts it is that, quote, "M finds D unpolished and lacking in dignity and refinement. D is inclined to be pert and familiar, insufficiently ceremonious, brusque, sometimes positively rude, always tiresomely juvenile." But M is capable of self-criticism and reflection, and she wonders whether this is really an accurate or true representation of who D really or most deeply is. And so she resolves to look again. She pays attention. Attention is this notion that Murdoch takes from Simone Weil. And roughly it means carefully observing what D says and does, and then reflecting on what that might say or mean. What might that tell you about who D really is? So M looks again, she pays D this attention, and as Murdoch puts it, quotes, "D is discovered not to be vulgar, but rather refreshingly simple, not undignified, but spontaneous, not noisy, but gay, not in that sense, not tiresomely juvenile, but delightfully youthful," and so on. And then Murdoch comments, "In resolving to look again in this way, M is, quotes, moved by love." So what we should make of this case has been contested. Kieran Setier, for example, suggests that the sort of love Murdoch has in mind here can't have anything to do with sort of love in the ordinary sense of the word. It has nothing, as he puts it, to do with fondness or affection or the desire for intimacy. But that doesn't seem quite right, because Murdoch explicitly states that the sort of love she has in mind ought to be, quote, entirely comprehensible to the ordinary person. So that won't quite work. Julia Driver suggests that what this case is meant to show is that loving someone can centrally involve attending to them with the aim of coming to see them in a positive light. So here what's really crucial is that M goes from having a negative view of D to having a positive view of D. And that's what makes this effort, this paying of attention, characteristic of love. But that's not quite right either, because Murdoch writes that by attending to D in this way, M comes to see her, quote, as she really is, right? So it's not sort of putting a positive spin on things. Rather, what really matters here is the accuracy of the new view that M arrives at, not its positive valence. Which leads us to what as far as I can tell, is sort of the dominant interpretation of what Murdoch is up to in presenting this case. So I've cited Susan Wolfe and Vida Yao as holding this position, which is that what this case is meant to show is that loving someone centrally involves attending to them with the aim of trying to understand who they really or most fully or most deeply are, in, as Yao puts it. Right? That is, love centrally involves this kind of epistemic project. I'm trying to get to know you in some sense. Now, this is the point where I can see that I'm not a Murdoch scholar. I'm not ultimately sure this is completely the right way to read Murdoch, but it seems to me to be a view worth considering in its own right, that love centrally involves this sort of epistemic project. Firstly, because it's also held by people who aren't directly inspired by Iris Murdoch. So, for example, Bell Hooks in her book All About Love, at least at one point, suggests something like this view. And also because it has, at least at first sight, some pretty plausible seeming sort of independent support. So often, and Susan Wolfe is one among many to push this sort of point, says, well, you know, suppose I had a false picture of who you really or most fully or most deeply were, then I couldn't really be said to love you in any meaningful sense, right? I'm misguided about who you are, and what I'm really in love with, if I'm really in love at all, is with this sort of this false picture, not with you. So if that's right, it's supposed to follow, I ought to be making an effort to see you, to come to a true picture of who you really or most fully or most deeply are. And then, and only then, will I be able to really love you in some meaningful sense. So that's one sort of line of thought. And then the other line of thought, which is a bit complex, and I will try to do justice to it, but I'm not sure I'll quite wrap my head around it. Vida Yao, in her paper, Grace and Alienation, asks us to consider the following sort of case. Suppose you're ashamed about something, something that you've done, or the sort of person that you are in some respect. Well, this is going to incline you to sort of isolate yourself, to withdraw, because you're going to be afraid that if people discover this aspect of yourself that you're ashamed of, then they're going to condemn you or dislike you or take up some negative attitude towards you. And wary of that possibility, you're going to be a bit standoffish, you're going to try to hide that part of yourself. And this is going to lead to sort of all sorts of negative effects like social isolation and so on, right? Now, we all need some sort of intimacy, closeness, right? It's no good to be socially isolated. So how can this sort of situation be escaped? Well, only if I do perceive you as you really are in that respect, and still love you anyway, still display affection for you and a desire for intimacy and so on. So the thought is, if love didn't involve this sort of epistemic project, then, and all it involved was some sort of affective element or a desire for intimacy or something like that, then we're to imagine a scenario in which I don't have an accurate or true picture of who you really are or something like that, but I still display affection for you anyway. And that's not going to escape the problem, because you're always going to be worried that you will discover this thing about me, and then your attitude towards me will change. Right? So the idea is, only if I become sort of transparent to you in this respect, and still you display affection for me, still you love me, will I get this respite from the sort of isolating effects of shame. So those are a couple of reasons, and I'll come back to them below. But this is the sort of the target that I want to attack, right? This idea that love pretty much always centrally involves this sort of epistemic project, this trying to get to know the beloved. Okay, so second section. I don't know whether the name Roland Barthes is familiar to you. It might well not be. Part of the motivation for this project is just because I think that this is a really cool thinker that just more Anglophone philosophers should be reading and think about. Or, you know, I'd like it if there were more people I could sort of talk to about him. So, you know, he's much less well known than his contemporaries like Michel Foucault or Louis Althusser or Gilles Deleuze and so on and so forth. at least within Anglophone philosophy. In France, he's huge, and in other places. One of his great admirers, Susan Sontag, who I'll come back to below, once wrote that of all the intellectual notables to appear in France in the 20th century, his was the name that she felt would most endure, which maybe hasn't transpired, but it's not to say that she hadn't sort of perceived some of the value there. Okay, so why I find Barthes interesting in this context is he seems to express in various ways a dislike of being paid attention to in this way, with the aim of people trying to sort of understand who he most deeply was. The way he puts it, talking about himself in the third person, is evidently he dreams of a world which would be exempt from meaning as one is from military service. So that is, he would love to live in a world where what he says and what he did didn't say something about who he was, or wasn't read as meaning something about who he most deeply was or who he really was. Likewise, he says, he is, quotes, troubled by any image of himself, suffers when he is named, and conversely finds the perfection of a human relationship in this vacancy of the image to abolish in oneself, between oneself and others, adjectives, right? Which is, I think, just such a stark contrast with the long list of adjectives that make up M's thoughts about D, right? M is obsessed with what sort of person D is, with sort of coming to this detailed description of who D most deeply is. And Barthes seems to be really reluctant to being sort of described in this way. And then likewise, he also writes, I always receive the adjective badly as an aggression, and I do so in all cases, no matter which value is attributed to it. So it's not just that he dislikes people perceiving those, his flaws, but rather even when they have sort of admiration for some of his qualities, he would rather that they not be thinking in terms about who he sort of really or most deeply was. And the other thing that's interesting about Barthes in this context is that there is one person who he felt didn't engage in this sort of attention, and that's his mother. So Barthes had this quite unusual relationship with his mother. His father died fighting in World War I when he was just a few months old, and he lived most of the rest of his life with his mother until her death in 1977, and he died in a car crash just 3 years later. So for most of his 65 years, he lived in an apartment in Paris with his mother. And what he keeps coming back to in various sort of scattered comments in some of his later work is the gratitude he felt towards his mother for refraining from trying to understand who he really or most deeply was. So in the diary he composed after her death, he notes that his mother, quotes, never made an observation about him, which, quotes, explained his horror of that word and of that thing. Right? Similarly, in a lecture course, he notes, she alone isn't the mother the only one who doesn't qualify the child, who doesn't force him into an assessment. Right? And then in his book, Camera Lucida, he first expresses an almost impossible wish for what he calls a neutral anatomical body, that is, a body that signifies nothing, where his actions won't say something or mean anything about who he sort of really is. And then he speculates that no one can give this to me, except perhaps my mother, out of love, extreme love. Right? So in the rest of the section, I want to do sort of two things. First, I'll say more about which quote-unquote adjectives Barthes has in mind. That is, in what respects did he not want to be sort of known or understood? And then I'll try to say something about why he sort of expresses this persistent wish. What needs might refraining from trying to understand who someone really is meet or respond to? Okay. So first, sort of which sort of adjectives does Barthes have in mind? I think the most prominent one is gay or homosexual, that it's his sexuality that he doesn't want people sort of getting to the bottom of, or seeing as sort of fundamental and sort of explanatory of who he is. So, of course, he doesn't say this explicitly. This is what makes this sort of interpretation quite hard, because that would defeat the point. If he doesn't want people to get to the bottom of something, then he's only going to allude to that sort of indirectly. But we get hints of it. So, for example, when he's describing what it's like to be interviewed, he comments that, quotes, every question is indiscreet. It is, however sublime its contents, inquiry about the sexuality of the other. Right? So he feels that his sexuality is what other people are trying to get to the bottom of. Now, in obliquely referencing his sexuality in this way, Barth would seem to be following his sort of favourite Latin motto, Larvatus prodeo, I advance pointing to my mask. I set a mask upon my passion, but with a discreet and wily finger, I designate this mask, right? So he's not saying it explicitly, but he's sort of indirectly pointing to it. And Barth felt that he wasn't alone, perhaps specifically among gay intellectuals of his generation, in writing this way. He notes that in what he writes, each protects his sexuality. And you can find some seeming confirmation for this in a remark of Foucault's from the preface to the Archaeology of Knowledge. So Foucault writes, I'm no doubt not the only one who writes in order to have no face. Do not ask who I am, and do not ask me to remain the same. Leave it to our bureaucrats and our police to see that our papers are in order. At least spare us their morality when we write. So both Barth and Foucault are expressing this reluctance to being read as gay authors, as if that's what's sort of deepest or most central to who they are, and therefore sort of the key to their works. And so it's sort of no surprise that these are the two people most associated with the phrase the death of the author, right? That they don't want their readers to be invested in this question of who they really are or what's important about them. They just want people to read their texts without sort of engaging in this sort of attentive inquiry. Now, I do just want to sort of mention a worry at this point, which is that you might worry, along with the literary critic D.A. Miller, that Barth's relation to the act of gay self-nomination is in fact nothing short of phobic, right? That it's just internalized homophobia that explains his dislike of people trying to get to the bottom of who he was sexually. I don't think that's right, and I'm convinced of that by Nicholas de Villiers, points out that homophobia often insists on knowing rather than refusing to know about the sexuality of gay people. And this is something that Barth himself knew in a passage I'll quote at length. I just think it goes really hard. He writes, to proclaim yourself something is always to speak at the behest of a vengeful other, to enter into his discourse, to argue with him, to seek from him a scrap of identity. You are, yes, I am. Ultimately, the attribute in question is of no importance. What society will not tolerate is that I should be nothing, or more precisely, that the something I am should be expressed as provisional, revocable, insignificant, inessential, in a word, irrelevant. Just say I am, and you'll be socially saved. Now, what I think is interesting here is, again, even though this is far from sort of a direct engagement, I think this really stands out as so different from the sort of interaction and desires that the Murdochians describe, right? What M is so invested in is precisely like who D sort of essentially is, right? Whereas what Barth wants is for who he is to be considered inessential, irrelevant, insignificant, right? That he wishes that people just weren't concerned, weren't invested in this question of who he really is, or most deeply is. Okay. So that's one aspect. It's his sexuality that he didn't sort of want people sort of trying to understand or get to the bottom of. Another example, possible example, is something like who he was politically and intellectually. So Barth, like most intellectuals of his generation, would have, or his milieu, identified sort of broadly with the left, but also like French intellectuals of his generation, that of Sartre and Beauvoir, were forever being pushed to declare exactly where they understood on the particular issue of the day, and to sign manifestos and statements and petitions and position themselves very carefully. And Barth found this exhausting, this pressure for people to get to the bottom of exactly sort of where he stood politically. He writes, the present day world is full of it, statements, manifestos, petitions, and so on. And it's why it's so wearisome. It's hard to float, to shift places. Likewise, early in his career, if Bard is known for anything in the Anglophone world, it's probably the sort of the death of the author essay that I mentioned previously, and also his early book Mythologies, a sort of work of cultural criticism. And Bart was really fed up with readers of this book trying to get to the bottom of whether it signified that he was a Marxist or not, right? I'm kind of reminded of the old joke about like, what's the difference between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy? Well, the difference can be understood by traveling to first Oxford and then Paris in the 1950s, right? Because in Oxford, they were only interested in one question, which was, what does the word ought mean? And in Paris, they were only interested in a different question, which was, ought I to join the Communist Party, right? This is the difference. And the question that people invested in was not only ought I to join the Communist Party, but where do other people stand on this issue? So Barthes complains of a particular review of this early book. Monsieur Guérin enjoins me to say whether I am a Marxist or not. Ultimately, what concern is that of Monsieur Guérin's? These kinds of questions are usually of interest only to McCarthyites. Right? This is sort of recalls Foucault's talk about sort of the police and bureaucrats, right? That typically in Barthes' view, and Foucault's view, it's police and bureaucrats who are really invested in this question of who I really am, what I fundamentally believe or subscribe to, right? Far from being sort of a loving relation, it's this sort of imposition or this sort of disciplinary relation. Similarly, again, he complains about being asked in interviews, how do you situate yourself with regard to Marxism, to Freudianism, to X, to Y? And it's that every such question comes from a subject who intends to find something other than a plain first degree answer, right? So his answers are always being read for what they mean, what they signify, what they say about the sort of person he is, and not just being sort of taken on their own merits, as it were. Okay, so that's a sense of sort of the aspects of who he was that Barthes didn't want people sort of trying to get to the bottom of. Why might it be loving not to try to get to the bottom of these things, to refrain from the sort of epistemic project that the Murdochian thinks we ought to be interested in? My sort of guiding thought here is that love in some way involves being responsive to people's needs. So we saw one example above, the sort of need to have respite from the sort of isolating effects of shame. You can think of this as sort of like the caring aspect of love. And I think we can find in Barthes' work at least a couple of needs to which refraining from engaging in this epistemic project can respond. Right? So the first is what I'm going to call a need for opportunities to rest from viewing oneself from an alienated perspective. Not catchy, but descriptive. And so this starts from a sort of phenomenological insight that Barthes has, which is that left to my own devices, sort of from the inside, as it were, as a subject, I, quote, never feel myself adjectivized, sorry. By which means that left my own devices, I won't sort of formulate answers to the questions of who I really am or most deeply am, right? It's only because I sort of need to give an account to other people of who I am that I might come to think of myself in these terms, or because I'm trying to figure out, what they think of me. I'm placing myself in their shoes, seeing myself through their eyes, right? And as such, quotes, the adjective always comes from the outside. When I'm trying to think about who I really or most deeply am, I'm sort of viewing myself from this third personal perspective. And this is the same sort of alienated third personal perspective that we find in a couple of familiar experiences that sort of Barthes sort of moans and groans about. So his last book, Camera Lucida, which is a study of photography, he has this sort of late interest in photography, but he hates the experience of being photographed. He writes, the photograph is the advent of myself as other, a cunning dissociation of consciousness from identity. And because of this, each time I am or let myself be photographed, I invariably suffer from a sensation of inauthenticity, that should be, sometimes of imposture, comparable to certain nightmares. I don't know how familiar this sort of feeling is to you, but I also hate seeing like pictures of myself. It never feels like quite me, right? And that's because it is this sort of third personal perspective. You're seeing people as other people see you and not as you sort of experience yourself from the inside. But again, wasn't alone among his contemporaries in feeling this way. So Sontag On Photography writes, to photograph people is to violate them by seeing them as they never see themselves. Sidebar here, during Alyssa's great talk earlier, I was thinking about Sontag, because within 2 weeks of her first semester at Chicago, she got engaged to one of her philosophy professors, which does, make you wonder about what it is about the U Chicago philosophy department. But anyway, close sidebar. Right. So this sort of experience of seeing photographs of yourself is one of these experiences, is sort of taking up this outside perspective on yourself. Another one is overhearing gossip of yourselves, about you. So Barth writes, gossip reduces the other to he or she, right? This sort of third personal relation. And this reduction is intolerable to me. The third person pronoun is a wicked pronoun. It is the pronoun of the non-person. It absents, it annuls. Again, it's sort of crowding out the sort of subjective first personal experience. And hence, I mean, he does like to exaggerate somewhat. In an ideal or utopian community, there would be no names, making it impossible for people to gossip about one another. There would be only direct addresses, presences, not images, absences. Okay, so to bring this all back to love, right? The idea is something like, if the people most immediately around you, the people you're closest to, are deeply invested in this question of who you really are or most deeply are, then you're going to be invested in this question too, right? Because you're going to care what they think about you. What do they make of who you really are? How's that going to affect your relationship and so on, right? But once you become also invested in this question, you're going to be likely to sort of consistently or regularly take up this sort of outside perspective on yourself, this sort of alienated perspective on yourself that I've just been describing. And there are various things you might say about why that might be bad. So Foucault, for example, would emphasize that this is likely to have sort of a disciplinary effect, right? This sort of viewing yourself from the outside, sort of panopticon light. What Barth emphasizes instead is just how sort of exhausting this is, right? To always be doing this mental work of, what do other people think about who I really am, right? What effects is that going to have for me going forward, and so on. So he writes, the adjective that comes from outside me upsets my quietude. I'm tried by being qualified, predicated. I rest by not being so. And what's the solution to this? Well, it's what Rudolf Turin, commenting on Barth, calls a timeout from meaning, right? By which he means time spent around people who aren't reading what I say and do as signs of who I really am, who aren't paying me that sort of attention, right? I can sort of let my guard down and not worry about people engaging in this epistemic project, what they're making of me and of what I'm doing. And this is exactly what Barth found at home with his mother. And that's why, one of the reasons why I think Barth described her refraining from engaging in this epistemic project as an act of, quotes, love, extreme love. So that's one of the needs that I think refraining from this epistemic project can respond to. Another one is what I'm going to call a need for opportunities to experience spontaneous freedom. So this draws on a recent paper by Jonathan Gingrich, where he elaborates this idea of spontaneous freedom. And I'm going to use this paper as a way to interpret a rather cryptic claim that Barth makes, which is that the adjective, the description of who someone most deeply is, seals up being into some kind of frozen image. It closes it up in a kind of death, he writes, which is all sort of very dramatic. So my claim is going to be that Barth here sort of identifies himself, his being, with his capacity for sort of novelty and originality, which is realized through experiences of spontaneous freedom, and that the adjective, the description of who someone really is, inhibits experiences of spontaneous freedom in a way I'll describe, and therefore seals up his sort of capacity for novelty and originality into some kind of frozen image, closes it up in a kind of death. This is sort of the idea. The idea is that, we feel sort of most alive when we're acting spontaneously in some way. And there's something deadening about sort of routine and habit and conforming to expectations. Okay. So here's what Gingrich has to say. He's interested, sorry, there's a protest for Palestine going outside my window. I feel like I should go out and sort of raise a fist in solidarity. But if you can hear any noise, sorry about that. Okay, so Gingrich is interested in what he calls spontaneous freedom, which is this valuable sort of freedom that's quite familiar in that it's picked out by talk of being free-spirited or sort of free as a bird, right? Such experiences are valuable because they activate what he calls our capacity for novelty and originality, for experiencing sort of newness in our lives. And that in turn is valuable because it confirms that we are not trapped by our own personal histories or the human past, right? This is sort of a deeply human capacity that we value sort of being activated, at least from time to time. And among the various necessary conditions on experiences of such freedom that Gingrich identifies, that they be open in the sense of being unplanned and unscripted, and unalienated in the sense of not having their source in something outside oneself. Now, I think that when the people sort of immediately around you have views about who you sort of really almost deeply are in some sense, then that's going to come with sort of a rich set of expectations about how you ought to behave, right? Once people thought of Barth as a homosexual or a Marxist, then with those adjectival descriptions come scripts, right, for how they think he's going to carry himself personally, intellectually, and so on and so forth. And once the people around you have this sort of rich set of expectations, you can easily find yourself in a kind of a double bind, such that you'll be unable to access these valuable experiences of spontaneous freedom. So on the one hand, it's usually just easiest to meet the expectations that people have of you, right, to follow their scripts. But in that case, your action isn't going to be open because you're following scripts, and nor is it going to be non-alienated because the scripts you're following are other people's, right? And again, Adam Phillips has this nice line. In this sort of situation, he writes, what begins in recognition ends in obedience in some sense, right? So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, if you do want to flout the expectations that people around you have of you, then that's often going to come at some sort of cost, right? They might interpret your action as sort of a failure of solidarity, like, I thought you were one of us, but now it turns out you're not, right? Or a failure of authenticity, right? I thought you were a real, whatever it may be, a real Marxist, say, in the sort of political, intellectual case, and yet now you're acting in this other way. You turned out not to be authentic. Or as a failure of honesty, right? You led us to believe that you were a real X, but in fact, you turn out not to be. So if flouting the expectations people have of you is likely to come at some sort of cost, you're likely to want to plan it. But then as soon as the action is planned, you once again have failed the sort of openness condition, right? You're no longer acting spontaneously. Moreover, even if you do successfully flout these expectations, people are likely to respond by simply following it, by forming a new script, right? So in the first place, they're going to form what we might call sort of the non-conformist script. They're going to come to expect that you will now do what they previously expected you wouldn't do, right? But then, if you flout that expectation, then they're going to form yet another script, call it the theocratic script, right? That you turn out not to be following through on your new path, you're displaying some sort of weakness of will, something like that, and you're now conforming to the original set of expectations they had of you. So again, it's going to be really tricky because the people around you are always going to have these expectations, and it's going to be really hard not to follow at least some of them. And when you do follow at least some of them, you're going to be failing both the openness and the non-alienation conditions. And then finally, if you act in such a way specifically in order to flout the expectations of people around you, just to be rebellious for the sake of it, then again, it's not properly spontaneous, because your action then in some sense has its source in their expectations still, right? It's still going to follow the sort of the fail the non-alienation condition. So the idea is only by being around people who don't have sort of a rich set of expectations about how you're going to behave, are you going to be able to act sort of truly spontaneously? And as such, again, the solution here is sort of a timeout from meaning, right? You're going to want the people you're closest to, most intimate with, not to be engaging in this epistemic project of trying to understand who you deeply or really or most fully are in various respects, so that you can have access to these experiences of spontaneous freedom. Okay, so that's the picture. That Barth gives us these reasons why we might not want the people around us to engage in this sort of epistemic project that Murdochians think is sort of just constitutive of loving someone, or constitutively involved, rather. It might not exhaust loving someone, but it is sort of a necessary part of it. Where does this leave us? Well, my kind of tentative suggestion is that it should probably leave us with a sort of pluralism, right? So I do still find especially Yao's case involving sort of the need to have respite from the sort of isolating effects of shame to be a sort of a compelling case for thinking that loving someone at least sometimes involves sort of trying to understand who they really are in some respect. But there seem to be other cases, like Bart's own case with him and his mother, in which loving someone seems to involve refraining from doing that. And so it seems like loving someone is sometimes going to involve pursuing this epistemic project and sometimes not. And that's going to depend on which of the beloved's needs are being met, or which are uppermost, or which of the beloved's needs the lover is best placed to meet or respond to. Right? And in particular, it might be that I want this plurality or variety of love relationships in one and the same life, right? It might be that I want some people to love me in such a way as to open up space to act spontaneously around them. And I might want other people to love me such that they can sort of obviate the isolating effects of shame, or, whatever it may be. Yeah. So that's this sort of pluralism. Why do I think that the Murdochians have sort of missed this sort of more complex picture? Well, a couple of reasons. One, the Anglophone literature on love seems to have suffered from what Wittgenstein would call like a one-sided diet of examples, right? So it's considered reasons and cases in which loving someone does involve pursuing this epistemic project, like Yao's case of the person who feels shame, but it just hasn't considered someone like Barth, whose priorities, whose most important needs are for what I've called the opportunities to rest from viewing oneself from this alienated perspective, and this need for opportunities to experience spontaneous freedom, right? So it's just a classic case of, we just needed a counterexample. But I think more fundamentally, there's this false assumption in both the sovereignty of good and in Murdoch's contemporary followers, which is that to the extent I don't have a true picture of who you really are, I must instead have a false picture, right? And we saw above how unattractive it is to think that someone who loves me could have a false picture of who I am, right? Because then it's not really me that they're loving. But what Barth shows, which is just a possibility that hasn't been considered, is that you might instead have no picture of who I am in some respect, right? So, if Barth's mother labored under the illusion that he was completely heterosexual, for example, then yes, she might be failing to really love him in some way. But the fact that she's just disinterested in his sexuality, that it's just not any of her business, and she simply refrains from forming a view, I don't think is so clearly a case of someone failing to love someone, right? In particular, because her doing so was so clearly responsive to his needs. Okay, that brings me on to an objection that I'm sure probably some of you have already been worrying about. And this really gets to the sort of the tenuousness of my project in trying to smash these two sort of thinkers from sort of different traditions together. which is that the idea is, look, Murdoch and Barth are talking at sort of cross purposes here, right? And that's because Murdoch is really engaged in sort of specifically moral philosophy. And what is crucial, according to this objector, about the example of M and D is that M attends to D with the aim of understanding who she really is, morally speaking, right? That it's a list of moral properties that get listed in this sort of long string of adjectives that Murdoch supplies. Whereas I've been talking about Bart's mother refraining from trying to understand who he really is, sexually speaking, politically speaking, intellectually speaking, and so on, right? And you might think that this just makes all the difference. But maybe the view should instead be, look, loving someone should be a matter of trying to figure out who they are, morally speaking, but not necessarily who they are in who they sort of really or most fully or most deeply are in other respects. And yeah, this objection definitely worries me. I mean, basically, I have this material on Barth, and I've been sort of like looking around for a target or some hook in sort of more familiar like Anglophone literature that I can hang it on, so I can eventually get it published in some sort of mainstream Anglophone journal outlet. And sort of I've touched on Murdoch. Maybe I'm wrong to do so, but I do have a couple of responses to this objection that at least soften it somewhat. So firstly, I'm not sure that the contrast is so clear here. So for one thing, Bart's sexual orientation in his time and place might well have been considered a moral matter. And it's certainly something to which at least many people in Bart's time and place would have attached some degree of shame, right? So if you're following Yao and what matters about the relevant properties that sort of the lover is trying to discern is how we, whether we feel ashamed about them, then this would qualify. And even now, you might think where someone stands politically or what projects they pursue politically is at least partly a moral matter, right? So this contrast between sort of the moral and, say, the sexual and, say, the political is not so clear-cut. But secondly, and I think more importantly, the same argument for the value of refraining from trying to understand who someone really is can be run with regards to at least some moral properties. So the example I particularly have in mind here is take a teenager, right? And the teenager's family have, paid careful attention to him over a long period of time, and they've discerned that he is sort of fundamentally a lazy person, right? Well, they might have been right to do so overall, but there are at least the sort of considerations that I had used before about non-alienation and about spontaneous freedom, right? So firstly, to live around people who are deeply invested in the question of whether you're fundamentally lazy or hardworking means that you're going to spend a lot of your time viewing yourself from this outside perspective when you're going to consider every time you engage in activity, am I demonstrating my laziness or my hardworkingness, right? And again, viewing yourself from this sort of outside perspective can be sort of exhausting in the way that Barth describes. And similarly, if the people around me have come to a view that I'm fundamentally lazy, then it's going to be very hard for me to spontaneously be hardworking, right? Because again, I'm going to be flouting their expectations. That's going to be something I'm going to be likely to want to plan. Then even if I do successfully flout that expectation, they're going to form a new expectation, namely that from now on, I'll be hardworking, right? And then again, it's going to be hard for me to be spontaneously lazy and so on. And the dialectic continues. So this is an argument, it seems to me, for there being perhaps someone in the teenager's life who loves them. And one of the ways in which they love them is precisely by refraining from investment in this question of whether the teenager is sort of fundamentally hardworking or fundamentally a lazy person. Right? Okay, so 5 minutes left. I just want to end with sort of a brief suggestion. So I've so far been concerned with what a sort of a Barthesian lover refrains from doing, right? They don't engage in this sort of epistemic project. And so I just want to end with a sort of suggestion for what they might do instead, right? And I kind of want to preserve this Murdochian idea that lovers pay some sort of attention to their beloveds, right? But the idea is that rather than paying attention to the surface with the aim of trying to discover the depths, right? With the aim of sort of reading everything that the beloved does as a sign of who they really are, I think they pay sort of careful attention to the surface for the sake of appreciating the surface in some way. So, as Barthes puts it in A Lover's Discourse, or to include a quote from there, my suggestion is that whereas the Murdochian lover approaches the beloved as a text to be deciphered or interpreted in some way, right? The Barthesian lover instead approaches the beloved as a text to delight in without having to decipher it. And there's this really neat coincidence that I just thought it's nice to draw attention to between something that Barthes says in A Lover's Discourse, which is that he asks, what do we mean when we describe someone we love as sort of adorable, or these other sort of descriptions like that? And he's saying, we're not actually saying anything very substantive about the lover. We're simply saying, that's it, right? That's it exactly, which I love, right? Is this almost like, maybe, if you think about like the end of the Tractatus, is this almost like mystical gesture of like, I don't know, like Nietzschean affirmation, right? You just say, yes, like that's it, that's what I love so much. And this is so similar to what he says in a book called The Pleasure of the Text about what it means to read for pleasure rather than for all the other purposes that you might read for. He says, if I agree to judge a text according to pleasure, then it can wring from me only this judgment, in no way adjectival. That's it, and further still, that's it for me. So what might this sort of surface appreciation look like in practice? Well, Barthes, even though he's not invested in, even though Barthes doesn't like people sort of trying to understand who he sort of deeply is, and is reluctant to sort of offer descriptions of who he sort of the most fundamental or important things about him, he's quite happy to mention sort of various surface features, right? He says, he gives examples of various things that he likes, right? So he likes Vivaldi and not Handel. He likes Picasso and not Miro. He likes peaches and not strawberries, right? And so the idea is, you would pay careful attention to what he likes and delight in his liking those things, something like that. Or perhaps a more sort of substantial example, drawing on a recent paper by Lila Braunschweig, but also, frankly, like some personal experience, is take someone who, until a certain point in their life, has sort of assumed that they are sort of straightforwardly cis, right? But now they're starting to explore their gender, to try out new modes of sort of dress and comportment. And they find that like everyone they come across is like deeply invested in this question of like, well, what does that signify, right? They're like colleagues at work, like, okay, are we going to start needing new pronouns? Is this just a phase, or is this something more permanent? That sort of thing. Strangers on the street are wondering, like, what is the gender of this person, and so on. And so it might be a relief to sort of come home and have someone that you're close to who just isn't invested in these questions of like what this exploration ultimately signifies, right? Like, are you ultimately trans, or are you still cis? Like, is this just a phase, or is this going to be a permanent thing, right? You might just delight in this beloved's sort of newfound joys and experiments and reliefs and explorations, right? Something like that. And yeah, I'll just finally note that this idea of sort of staying on the surface and just paying attention to the surface and delighting in that fits with Sontag's characterization of Barthes as an aesthete. That is, as someone who thinks that, quotes, depths are ultimately obfuscating, demagogic, that no human essence stirs at the bottom of things, and that freedom lies in staying on the surface, the large glass on which desire circulates. So yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Nick, for this amazing talk. I think it was just the right talk to close the to close the workshop on love, sex, relationships, and everything around it. I enjoyed it very much, and I hope that everyone else in the audience enjoyed it just as much. And now we will be taking questions from the audience. Yes, Jen?
Sorry, I was trying to find all the buttons are in the wrong places now. Thank you, Nick, so much for this. This was really cool. So I really don't know anything about Bart or Murdoch, so but I was wondering what you thought about a possible connection here. So I don't know if you've read Ray Langton's Duty and Desolation. But okay, but yeah, so I'll just say a little bit just to like give the context for my question. But so if you all haven't read this paper, it's very good. It's a very good paper. And in it, she's sort of like investigating questions of like friendship and the wrong of deception, but does so like through this story about this woman named Maria von Herbert who has this kind of like ongoing and kind of agonizing correspondence with Kant about a live omission that she has told her then like partner, and I think like to be like they were betrothed. She had concealed the fact that she wasn't a virgin, or at least this is what you like draw from the correspondence. And like once the partner like learned the truth because she felt really guilty about it, she wrote to Kant. She's like, you say I shouldn't lie, and I feel really guilty about it. And so but then it like destroys her relationship when she tells the truth because he leaves her. And anyway, throughout the course of the paper, Langton argues that like not only does it seem like maybe she wasn't wrong to lie in this case, but maybe she even had a duty to conceal it because this fact about her in the non-ideal social moral context like made it harder for her like betrothed, her beloved, to like see her as a person. And so I was wondering like what you thought about that, like not just like the role of like the epistemic project is in like seeing the truth, like the full you are being like engaged in this epistemic project of like investigating the positive knowledge, but also the role deception could play in this context as well.
Great, thanks. Yeah, firstly, just on Duty and Desolation, Langton just has that ability that I just aspire to so much for, just like the great title, like Duty and Desolation, speech acts and unspeakable acts. Like, come on, it's just so good. Anyway, so yeah, thanks. It's a really interesting example. So I guess I have kind of a couple of thoughts. One is that, so in this situation, what we're imagining is like this like patriarchal guy, right, who thinks it's a really bad thing for his partner to be not to be a virgin. And so one reading you could give to this case is that the problem here is like the false meanings that he attaches to virginity or chastity or whatever. And so on this reading, all we need to do is sort of like clean up the falsehoods, right? And then it will be fine for him to sort of think about her as a virgin. Like Wittgenstein at one point talks about like sending concepts away for cleaning, right? Now it is like we're gonna like take this concept out of circulation, we're gonna strip all the bad influences out of it, and then we're gonna like put it back in. And so the analogy would be like to take like Bart's case. It's like, well, maybe he's just worried about homophobes who attach all sorts of like negative or like false meanings to homosexuality. And if he was living like 50 years later, you know, in a much more sort of like affirmative community, then, you know, he wouldn't be so worried about people thinking about him as gay. And so, I mean, I think this gets something, right? Like, I think like the false meanings are probably like, you know, they're obviously more problematic than like the positive meanings. And in particular, you might think that this is sort of like what something like the hermeneutical injustice literature picks out. Like, there's an injustice here of like not being able to sort of render yourself intelligible. And like the relevant interest that's not being satisfied here is an interest you have in intelligibility. But yeah, And where this comes in is that actually this BART project was like tacked on to the end of like my PhD thesis on homeownership and justice, because what I want to say is actually this reading doesn't get things, doesn't say everything there is to say about this case. So like the false meanings are problematic, and it's problematic if you can't render yourself intelligible. But actually the positive meanings can also be problematic, right? So like even the sort of the true inferences or the truth tracking inferences that people were liable to draw about Bart's homosexuality would have sort of been restrictive in the sense I tried to bring out, right? So like, for instance, he really was like very promiscuous, for example, right? Which would have been like a true inference that a lot of people would be liable to draw. So, you know, they're not wrong about that, but the fact that they expect that of him then inhibits possibilities for spontaneity. He's going to be viewing himself through that lens from the outside and so on, right? So to come back to the Maria von Herbert example, the thought is like, even if the patriarchal husband to be sort of didn't think it was a really bad thing that she wasn't a virgin, still to be like invested in the question of whether she is a virgin or not, regardless of like what further normative implications he attaches to that, is going to have these sort of like alienating and spontaneity inhibiting effects, right? So, even if your husband to be won't sort of mind or take it out on you if you have like premarital sex, it might still be a consideration when you're deciding whether or not to have premarital sex, which makes it harder to have that premarital sex spontaneously, if you see what I mean. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and something I could maybe bring out more in the material, that it's not just about like the false inferences that people are liable to draw. It's like the true inferences can be just as inhibitive in the way I described.
All right, Cassie.
Well, thank you for this talk. Really interesting. I mean, I only know Murdoch's fiction, and that has really wild ideas about what love is and how love can go in the world. But I'm curious about your suggestion towards a pluralism, that sometimes loving involves the aim of understanding, sometimes not, and we need to recognize both of those. But right then there's the sort of paradox that arises as well, in order to figure out whether this is the sort of person who should be loved by being understood versus loved by not being understood. You have to understand what sort of person they are, or what their needs are. So, I mean, do you think that there's some sort of tension there, that would sort of resolve towards what Jen was suggesting? Or the other thought I had there is that something like a distinction between loving and unconditionally loving might come up. Say that to love someone unconditionally, it doesn't matter how well you know them or what you might uncover, because that shouldn't change anything. So there might be a story there. So I'm curious about your thoughts on it, all that.
That's great. Yeah, there's so much there. I'll just start briefly with, like, you mentioned Murdoch's fiction. Like, in a way, I don't think it's an accident that Murdoch is a novelist and also holds these views, in that as an artist, you're also going to be invested in, like, suppose you want to sort of make art out of the lives of the people around you, then you're going to want to pay them exactly the sort of attention that Murdoch describes, right? Because it's going to be a better story if you like really understand who they are. So like Philip Larkin describes meeting her at one point and says, she just asks so many questions. She has just like a real novelist interest in everyone she meets. And yeah, so there's like sort of the second part of this project is meant to be how this bears on sort of questions about sort of like autofiction and that kind of thing, of like the ethics of making art out of the lives around you, because you're going to sort of necessarily be involved in this sort of like epistemic project. And that also, that's the whole thing's inspired by the film Portrait of a Lady on Fire, and I won't get into, but just like it's so good. Anyway, sorry, sidebar. So then there were 2 points. One was about pluralism, one was about unconditionality. So on the pluralism point, I think it is a good point. I guess my two initial thoughts are, one, it's hopefully softened by this idea that like you want a variety of love relationships in your life, and you might get one thing from one person from another. And so that sort of takes the stakes out to some extent of like what any one person does, because hopefully there's someone else fulfilling those other needs. And then that linked with that is something like, the other thought is it's a question of sort of what comes naturally to different people. And so it might be less a matter of like a conscious decision and more a matter of sort of like your sort of attachment style, as it were, something like that. If you are like Murdoch, this sort of novelist interest sort of seems to come naturally, right? She can't help but try to sort of like inquire into other people around her, something like that. But yeah, I agree it does make it tricky. There is something sort of paradoxical there. And is also perhaps why Bart's case is hard to know sort of how unusual it is. Like he does have this quite unusual relationship with his mother, and it's not always clear that he realizes how unusual it is. Like he writes sort of generically, like, aren't mothers the only people who like don't inquire about their children? And it's like, well, I think quite a lot of mothers are quite invested in like who their children are, right? Yeah, so that's one thing. And then on the sort of the unconditionality, I think the idea is that, yes, I guess I'll say a couple of things. One is, it's sort of, I think you're right that it sort of comes back to Jen's point, that definitely this idea of loving unconditionally, where I say like, even if I sort of detect flaws in you, I'll love you anyway, kind of thing. That's probably better than saying, any flaw and I'm out. But it's not obvious to me that that's like always going to be a better attitude than I'm just not too invested in the question of flaws. Now you might get problems here about like, well, what about loving like really bad people? And I think this is a really tricky question, to which I'll just like fire off some just thoughts, sort of quick fire. One is to distinguish between like what it is to love someone and whether you ought to love them. So it might still be that like, if we're trying to give an account of what love actually involves, it might still be that like what loving a really bad person might involve might be not taking a view on some of their sort of like bad character traits, but you might think you ought not to love that person. That might be a separate question. Secondly, this contrast between having a sort of a true picture and a false picture and no picture. Like, I think it's obviously bad to wrongly believe that a bad person is really good, but less clear just that it's really bad simply to not take a view on whether a bad person is really bad or really good. And in particular, you might think, here's this like, I mentioned Foucault, who's quite similar to Barthes in a lot of ways. Like Foucault in Discipline and Punish traces this transition from late 18th century, where we're still punishing acts, but we're not interested in like punishing people, to new forms of punishment in which we're really invested in like punishing people, right? Punishing like them sort of more thoroughly in this way. And so like the criminal becomes like a species, like a sort of person, right? And you might think that, what a Barthesian could do is like, we're going to condemn this person's acts, but we're still not going to be invested in like what that shows about like what sort of person this really is, right? You can still hold people to account for acting in certain ways without being invested in questions of like, is this a super stable trait across time? How much of like your conduct does this trait explain, and so on and so forth. Those are just some thoughts.
Any more questions?
I mean, I have
If
another
not-
follow-up, if not, well, others are
Because,
percolating.
sorry, what?
I have a follow-up sort of question while others have thoughts percolating. Because Could I ask real quick?
Yeah, sure.
Uh, so all of this sounds very anti-virtue. Is that right? Like we should not consider people as they are and their actions reflecting on the kind of person they are, that adjectives limit. So like saying someone is an honest person limits their possibilities and we shouldn't make those judgments. Is there a way to square it with virtue theory? Because I'm interested.
Yeah, it's something I definitely need to think a lot more about, because I definitely neglected to mention the extent to which Murdoch thinks of love as like a sort of virtue, and it playing a part in like a unity of the virtues, and her kind of weird conception of virtue on which it's sort of almost all about perception and hardly anything about action. But so yeah, I definitely need to get into that a bit more. And it does go to my worry that I'm not sure Murdoch, the sort of are Murdoch and Bart talking past each other worry. I guess so. There's sort of like an ontological and a normative level to it. So there's one question of like the ontological question of like, are there virtues? Like, do people have like stable character traits over time that manifest in like predictable ways and so on? And I think I'm kind of neutral on that question. And then there's like a normative question of, like what role, if there are these traits, ought they to like play in our thinking? Like how ought they to make an appearance there, if at all? And I guess the Barthesian idea is like, even if people do have stable character traits, maybe we ought not to be too invested in, trying to perceive them, something like that. I'm trying to think how this all fits in with the sort of like the situationist kind of critique of virtue ethics that like does talk to that ontological level. It's like actually our actions are far more determined by the situations we find ourselves in, rather as opposed to our sort of our character traits. And you might think something like, what the situationist critique shows is that our actions often don't mean what we think they mean, right? Like we think we're so used to reading what we do as signs of who we are, and that only works if they are the outcome of like stable character trait. Whereas if they're just like a spontaneous response to the situation, then sort of like our actions might mean or say less about us. And so then the Barthes is sort of even sort of stronger than the Barthesian position, which is like we ought not to like attribute meaning or ought not to try to find meaning. But it may be that like there's no meaning there to be found, right? And that would be, there'd be like a stronger version of the Barthesian view and would sort of be a point against Murdoch. But you and probably lots of people know that sort of literature a lot better than me, because I just remember this as like something that was mentioned for 10 minutes in an undergraduate lecture about 8 years ago. So I just know that like the situationist critique exists. I don't know of its sort of status in the literature. But it's definitely something I should think about more. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Cassie, because I was trying to get a hold on the very disparate thoughts I was having, and I think you gave me this hold. So, full disclosure, I'm sort of a Murdochian, so I hope I'm not coming across as too confrontative.
Go for it.
But I think one aspect about Murdoch's theory is very important, and that is she's a Platonian. And for her, this reality that becomes epistemically accessible through attention is not the empirical reality of the person in question. It's a morally charged reality from the very beginning, an evaluative, a reality where empirical and evaluative concepts interlock. And I think the way you presented the readings of Murdoch that you were going to critique, my impression was that they do not regard this aspect about her theory. And and what Cassie said, I think, because in this context, Murdoch emphasizes that getting a clearer moral view opens up possibilities of action. The more subtleties of the moral reality we can see, the more possibilities we have. And I think might especially tie into the example you gave in the end about the person who comes to questioning their gender but doesn't have it quite figured out. And Murdoch says that false conceptions are stereotypical, superficial, but when we see this person for what they really are, by gaining a more elaborate evaluative vocabulary, we can overcome the stereotypical conceptions and see their individual empirical and ideal reality. I was wondering what you were to say about that.
Yeah, great. I mean, I think you're definitely right that, as I say, the structure of the project is that I'm starting with Bart and sort of looking around for a target, and I'm sort of hooked on Murdoch, but I don't know Murdoch nearly as well as I should do. And definitely part of it is her Platonism that I sort of didn't really discuss. Now, I guess what I would say in my defense is maybe I then really am discussing less Murdoch than sort of Murdoch as it strikes Yao and Wolf, much as you might talk about Wittgenstein as it strikes Kripke or what have you. And in particular, I think I'm doing so because I maybe just find their sort of metaphysically lighter versions of what's going on just sort of more plausible, and that's kind of my own sort of bias or prejudice coming in. How does the Platonism come in? Well, one place it comes in is that Murdoch thinks that we are fundamentally, to begin with, in the cave, right? That we find ourselves beginning with sort of a false picture of the world, or like our vision of the world is shrouded with sort of illusion, right? And that what we need is to get out from behind that sort of veil and discover the world as it really is. And one of the things I was trying to say is that I think what Bart shows, or at least what I'm trying to use him to show, is the extent to which we might simply not have a picture, right? So I think Murdoch is sort of led by this Platonic background into this idea that you have either a false picture or a true picture. And then I agree it's better to have a true picture than a false picture. But if you don't think that we begin in the cave, right? If you think we begin in sort of neutral ground of having no picture, then it might lose some of its force. Yeah, in terms of the idea is to sort of get a description that hugs closer and closer to the individual in a way, and is less and less reliant on generalizations. Yeah, I feel really conflicted, which is why I appeal to this sort of like pluralist view, because I do kind of get this attraction with the idea of sort of being seen through, or being, that feeling when for the first time someone really gets you in some way. Like I get the attraction of that. On the other hand, you might think the tighter this description is, the more it is zoomed on you in particular, and the less reliant it is on generalizations, then the richer and richer the set of expectations are that are going to come with that, right? And the richer and richer picture that person is going to have of you, that you're going to be tempted to sort of adopt and explore and see from their perspective. So you might think that as much as, I get the attraction of sort of not being stereotyped and so on and so forth, but the better someone knows you, still the harder it's going to be to sort of act spontaneously. So, for example, and again, this comes back to this idea that you might get different things from different relationships, right? So, my parents have known me for 28 years, right? They have a very rich sense of who I am in various ways that aren't reliant on sort of stereotypes or generalizations as someone who had just met me might. But precisely because of that, home is, when I go back to visit parents, that's exactly one of, I get all sorts of benefits from that relationship, right? Like I feel like they get me in various ways. Like I do have that feeling. But also at home with parents is not a place where I enjoy much sort of spontaneity, right? Precisely because, and yeah, to come back to the gendered example, when in the last couple of years, I was, started like wearing more makeup, for example, something like that. That's a lot easier to do around people who don't have 26 years of experience of me not doing that, right? And who now like have a rich set of expectations they are going to need to update, to sort of do that without worrying or planning or sort of announcing in advance kind of thing. So yeah, I kind of get the pull in both directions. But thanks for your question. I should definitely sort of address the Plato stuff.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the next question is from Mike.
Thanks. So some of what I was thinking was kind of similar to things Kay said, but I'll avoid that. I think what I want to push back on is the idea that that any true picture of somebody could actually be constraining on their spontaneous action. Because if you know someone, then you know that they're a free being who's capable of spontaneous action and spontaneous judgment and all the other spontaneous stuff that free individuals like ourselves can do. And so if somebody has an expectation, which is a result of a picture that they've got of you, then that's not an accurate picture if it constrains the possibilities for spontaneous action which you genuinely have. It's kind of, so I said I would avoid the things Kay said, but I'll mention one thing, which is basically it's like these adjectives, kind of adjectivizing people in the way that Bart didn't like, is the sort of thing you do because you don't, it's something you do instead of knowing somebody really well. If you know somebody, like you were talking about with not needing to rely on stereotypes, but if you don't know somebody that well, you know them fairly well, not that well, then you might stereotype them and and just say, oh, well, they like rock concerts or something, and so you're always buying them rock concert tickets and whatever, and this is sort of constraining on them. But it's not. But if you have a more nuanced picture of them, then you don't need to resort to the kinds of adjectives which are putting Bart in a box. So what I'm sort of pushing back on is this sort of true picture, false picture, no picture trichotomy that you are having. But it's like this, the no picture is sometimes the true picture, because if someone is a free individual, as you recognize, if you're sort of treating them in a way that doesn't rely on shortcuts, then no picture is the true picture, because how they are doesn't determine, it doesn't constrain their possibilities for spontaneous action. And so having a true picture of someone can't actually constrain them in that way. So yeah, sometimes the no picture is the true picture in cases like that, I'd like to suggest.
Great, thanks. Yeah, it kind of reminds me, I don't know whether you know David Bellamond's paper, which is called something like Love as a Moral Emotion, something like that.
I'm afraid I don't.
But so he has this idea, he tries to sort of run Murdoch and Kant together, basically. So he likes the Murdochian idea that paying sort of careful attention to someone is an important part of love. But he thinks that what the lover is paying attention to is these like universal Kantian properties of sort of autonomy, and it's sort of what you recognize when you pay careful attention to someone is that they are sort of a rational being capable of exercising sort of freedom, something like that. So that sort of slight, what you were suggesting sort of slightly reminds me of sort of that view.
No, it sounds like it should remind you. I was sort of feeling a bit Kantian when I started talking in that way myself.
Right. Yeah. And so sort of it's a neat idea, but I don't think it in practice gets Murdoch right. So Murdoch really emphasizes paying attention not to these universal capacities that we share, like for instance for spontaneity, but really for all the particular individuating features of someone, right? Like M picks out all the things that make D different from other people. And so what you might think is something like, okay, so you form a view of someone, but also because you recognize that they're capable of acting spontaneously, you hold these views sort of tentatively, like you only you sort of handle them as like rules of thumb, right? And you're very happy to sort of revise or update your expectations. I guess I'd say a couple of things. So one is, yeah, one is that even though I think that might lessen the sort of the issue, I don't think it sort of completely obviates the issue, which is like, even if you hold the views tentatively and you're very willing to update them, still you might, react with some degree of sort of surprise, right? Like it's not really an expectation if you're not willing to feel surprised, or if it doesn't sort of spark further questions, right? It might, what you thought was the case might turn out to be false, but now you have a whole new set of questions about like, so what is true, right? And once you inquire into that, that's going to generate new sets of expectations and so on. And so that's still going to, it's not a hard and fast constraint, like, but it's more, it makes it difficult to act spontaneously. And that's partly because, to say the second thing, the problem is not just what do you expect of me, but what do I think you expect of me? So it might be that you're this sort of very ideal lover who holds all their views like very tentatively and sort of aren't too invested in any of the questions and so on. But I can't always know that in advance, right? I can't always know how you're going to respond when I act in some seemingly new way, right? And so I'm going to want to plan, even if those plans turn out not to be useful or important, something like that. Yeah, I guess I'd say those two things. But yeah, thanks. I think that's it is worth thinking about. I think that there is this structure where to make the paper work, you sort of maybe have to exaggerate differences that maybe aren't you just to sort of create the contrast, whereas in fact, yeah, they might be closer together in some respects. Thank you.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah. Well, I'm happy.
I'm not muted. So you said, I think, that Murdoch's kind of list of properties doesn't seem like the sorts of things that Bellman was talking about in the paper, which I have not read. But I think one that it might be closer than your it might be closer than you might think, because one thing which is, I think, really sort of sticks out about Murdoch's two lists, the before and after lists, is that they're all sort of very, very close, kind of descriptively, but one of them with a positive evaluation and the other one with a negative evaluation. And also, in particular, the before list is all bad things, and the after list is all good things. Right? You can sort of tell from the language used that one's good and one's bad. And so, if you might think, well, and so it's not a good example if her point is just that in a completely value neutral way, love is about paying attention to someone, getting to know what they really like, then it's not a good example to just have. It turns out that all of the things that you find out are replacing bad properties with good properties. But one way that you might sort of reconcile that is by thinking about, if you sort of think of the kind of I mean, I want to use the word constitutivist, but the kind of Kantian idea that making sense, if you can make sense of, for making sense of an action and justifying an action aren't just entirely orthogonal to each other. And so when you understand why she, doesn't like complicated things or whatever these sort of the kind of descriptive counterparts of these properties are, if you like. When you understand why she is like this, and you sort of put the work into to really understand her as this autonomous individual, then you end up reevaluating the sort of data in a more positive way, just because you're seeing why she does it, and sort of seeing it as the sort of thing a sensible person would do, or a good or reasonable person would do, rather than just something that someone would do because they were just being foolish. So if you kind of get to know someone in the kind of ways that you said that Vellman was talking about, then that's the kind of thing which could lead to the sort of reevaluation that Murdoch describes, in a way that explains why it goes from all these listed negatives to these listed positives, which calls for an explanation, I think, unless in the context there's another explanation for why she does that.
Yeah, good. I think this comes back to something Kay was saying about sort of the Platonism as well. And it does concern me. I don't think I immediately have an answer. The idea being something like, yeah, well, when I gave this objection that it mattered that the moral property, like that Murdoch seemed concerned with moral properties and Bart seemed concerned with other properties, I think maybe a stronger version of that objection is something like, it's not the nature of the properties that really matters, but it's like the fact that the perception itself is sort of value laden in some way, that it's not some sort of neutral observation of what happened to be moral properties, but rather, yeah, like it's the morality comes in earlier in some way. I've got to spell out better what I mean, but and that does seem like a pertinent difference that makes it sound like they are talking about different things. Yeah, it's. I guess this is another one of those places as well where maybe I've come up with a picture that I just find more sympathetic than Murdoch's, and has sort of decided to engage with that picture instead, because Murdoch maybe does just have this very strongly moral view of like what love is or involves. And I guess I'm just intuitively not so drawn to that view, partly because you start to get sort of like trading up problems and stuff like that. So you start to think, well, if what love is picking out is like how good a person is, then like why shouldn't I just, as soon as I find a better, a morally better person, why shouldn't I sort of love them more, love them instead, right? This sort of worry. That as soon as like love has sort of reasons in some way. But yeah, it's I think you're right. It's just something I need to think about more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Since no one else is raising their hand, I would like to ask another question, which touches on the room for spontaneity that you mentioned. Spontaneous freedom, yes, that was the term. So, because Murdoch's moral theory arises from the critique for what she calls existentialist moral philosophy, by which she means not only French existentialism, but also the early Oxbridge moral philosophy of Stuart Hampshire, Richard Hare, even Ayer is an existentialist. So, and on this view, so we have the will is like an unmoved mover, which is separated entirely from the world and is in some sense uninfluenced by the world. And I was thinking that in these Barthian picture seems to be a resonance of this view, because the idea seems to be that we need the opportunity to create ourselves anew at any time we should like. And I think Murdoch pretty explicitly says that this is not a useful way to think about our agency and our personhood. And to her, what matters is what is going on between these episodes. And these episodes are only the manifestation of who we really are, but it's not that we create ourselves in these outer events of acting. So is Spartian a Murdochian existentialist, or is there more to his story?
Thanks. Yeah. I just once you mentioned it, 'cause it is a great passage of Murdoch. I thought it was that I'd read. She says that the exercise of our freedom is a small piecemeal business which goes on all the time, and not a grandiose leaping about unimpeded at important moments, right? Which is I mean, it is a good line, fair play. So I guess what I would say is, like, I'm drawing on Gingrich here, and the idea is he's not trying to give an account of like freedom in general. So this is an account of like it's neither an account of sort of libertarian free will and libertarian freedom that you might have in terms of like free will, in like the sense that existentialists might have that sort of view of what it is to have free will, nor is it a sense of like political freedom. He's zoning in on what he thinks is like an unexamined sort of freedom, which, yeah, is the sort of freedom that's picked out by talk of someone being like free-spirited, right? And this is meant to be sort of like quite an everyday idea, and it's like it characterizes how someone conducts a life and is not sort of a deeply metaphysical description. And the idea is not that we want to act in these sorts of ways all the time, but that we just want some opportunities to act spontaneously sometimes, right? So yeah, I think therefore we can allow sort of the idea is something like, it's great to live like a Murdochian life, just like 90% of the time, right? Where it's all about this like small piecemeal business and so on. But sometimes we just want to like let go and just like forget about, our lives and just sort of, put it all to one side and just sort of, go crazy for a little bit, right? So yeah, I guess the main thing I'd say is just this idea that like, this isn't meant to be an account of freedom in general, which sort of is what separates sort of Barth and Gingrich from the Sartres of the world. But yeah, that's something I could bring up more.
Thank you. We have a question from Fabien.
Excellent, thank you. So firstly, great talk. I've learned a lot. I read Murdoch, like The Sovereignty of Good back in undergrad. Haven't really engaged with it ever since. So just for my own edification, mostly, and hopefully for others, when we're talking about the kind of like epistemic project of love, the example of I forget the characters' names off the top of my head, but of the person trying to know the other person and like who they really are, it strikes me that the actual adjectives involved they don't actually change a lot. Like the connotations change. So like the thick part of the description changes, but the thin description doesn't. Like the behaviors are more the same. So I'm wondering what part of the getting to know who they really are is actually involved here, or is it just a process of like getting to know why these things are good, and how that might actually influence like the pigeonholing that might be going on here, if that makes sense.
Yeah, good. So I think part of the reason why Murdoch, this example is really hard to get to grips with, is that Murdoch's trying to do like multiple different things with it. And one of the things she's trying to do with it that I sort of haven't mentioned yet is she's trying to push back on this view that morality only assesses like public actions, right? And she wants to say that an important part of the moral life is like what goes on internally, like perceptually. And so because that's one of the things she's trying to do, something she holds the same is that basically she says, look, it's not as if these two people suddenly like engage in dialogue with each other or something like that, right? It's just one person has like a set of observations about this daughter-in-law D, and she just spends some more time mulling over what they might mean or signify. So this is sort of like an artificial constraint on what the project of like what getting to know someone might look like in real life, where like you're going to be talking to them, right? And you might ask them like, what do you really like in this or that respect? So that's I think that's part of what explains why there's this such a neat symmetry. Is because Murdoch has sort of artificially made it such that these two people can't explore further. It's like we've limited the subject matter, and now we're going to see what we can do with it. Yeah, I mean, at the same time though, I do need to give a better account. So like Murdoch does say that what matters here is the accuracy, right? That is like she does have this quote that love is knowledge of the individual, and also M comes to see D as she really is. So it seems to be the accuracy that she's emphasizing, and so therefore I sort of glibly said the fact that it comes to be in a positive light is sort of merely incidental. But I think what a lot of you pointed to, and quite right, is that I need to say something a bit more satisfying than that, right? Like it can't be just a complete coincidence. Yeah, people have speculated whether it could be. So can you imagine a situation where the descriptions are reversed, right? Like she starts off with the positive view, and then having paid more attention, she comes to the negative view. And would we still instinctually characterize that as loving? Well, if you take Murdoch's sort of Platonism seriously, you think that love is bound up with like the discovery of reality in some way, and that's just what really matters. Then maybe, yeah, Murdoch would be committed to saying that. It's just a pity that because she's trying to do all these different things at once, and as Kay mentioned, she's she's trying to engage sort of like contemporary French existentialist thought, and also the sort of like Anglophone background, and engage, she's trying to do all these different things in the essay. It would be great if she just had like a more contemporary analytic approach, which is just like, I will consider, I'll spell out some necessary and sufficient conditions and like try these 5 different variants of the case or what have you. So yeah, it'd be worth saying something more to strengthen the case that the fact she ends up in a positive light isn't what we should be focusing on. It would be good to say more about that case where, well, what if someone ends up in a negative light? Is that still loving on the Murdochian account? But yeah, thanks.
Okay. Are there any more questions? Yes, Jay.
I'm being my freedom is being impeded by a cat, so I'm in lounge mode. Oh, don't get disturbed, Odie. It's okay. So I'm quite unfamiliar with the philosophers that you've been talking about, but I'm super interested in been listening to the Q&A, and I was curious if another perspective could be like if you've thought about this or engaged with a like feminist literature of care that establish sort of like the one I'm most familiar with is a book called Caring to Know by the professor Verinda Dalmia, who is one of my advisors. But there are others who have engaged in something like an epistemic requirement of knowledge is love or care or a particular, the kind of relationship of understanding is not one of like abstract knowing, but knowing is an achievement of a relationship or through relationality. So I'm curious, although I don't know exactly how these traditions compare, if that framework would be interesting or helpful or useful or interesting to expand upon. A side note, I really, this conversation, which I've been enjoying as a chair, not as a fully fledged autonomous human being, reminded me of a question a student had for me this week about free will and about whether or not this kind of question is interesting. And as philosophers, sometimes we entertain questions that really we don't care about as humans, but we care about as philosophers, like libertarian free will or something. It might be so abstract I don't really care whether or not it's true or not. I'm going to keep living as if it is, just because, I mean, come on. But I'm curious about what your thoughts are of, is this a framework that I can turn them towards, like a different conversation about freedom that is maybe more useful and interesting? Because I think they can get really caught up in the abstract, like many philosophers do. But we're kind of, you mentioned everydayness, and everydayness is a huge motivation in how I think about philosophy and how I frame it. So those aren't coherently related to each other. There's just comments and kind of a question. So feel free.
Great, yeah, thanks. So I'd say I haven't thought that much about like feminist care ethics in this context. The one thought that comes to mind is there's this great little book by Hill Malatino called Trans Care, about like what a specifically like transgender care ethic might look like. And he's interested in like we're living through a time of like trans like hyper visibility, right? That like trans people's transness is considered so important by like the public discourse. And so what might you get from like a T for T, like a trans for trans relationship? You might get precisely someone not being so invested in like the question or significance of your transness, right? Like what it like deeply says about you, because it's just sort of like taken for granted as this like background condition. So there's like maybe one thought there. As for the how to talk about freedom, yeah, it's sort of not my area, but I would recommend like this Gingerich paper, which is in ethics from a couple of years ago, which I was put onto by Amir Srinivasan. And it's yeah, it's really good. And one thing he does say is that like on the sort of the libertarian free will thing, he says, look, it's the attraction that people who end up as libertarians about free will start from like a valid intuition about something that is valuable in our lives, and then it just metastasizes into this sort of like grand metaphysical theory that involves us in this sort of constant grandiose leaping about, as Murdoch puts it, right? And he says, yeah, so he says like it's interesting because he does give libertarians sort of their due in a way that like he gets the impulse there in a way that it's sometimes just completely dismissed by like compatibilists, right? But he says that what you're trying to get at is a sort of an everyday, the value of an everyday occasional experience of spontaneity, and not, you know, sort of a Kantian like transcendental inference to like we must be absolutely free in the noumenal, if not in the phenomenal, or whatever, right? So yeah, and and he talks interestingly about art being a place in which we can, or the making of art being an interesting site for the experience of this sort of freedom and so on, which yeah concretizes it a bit in a way that can be, well, is like very abstract if like all you're reading is like the first critique or whatever.
Thank you so much.
Yes, Cassie has a question.
Yeah, so all of these discussions have made me wonder about sort of broader methodological aims that you have throughout this, because I think it sounds like part of it is you think that there's a story to tell about philosophy of love that is best captured in this particular way. And like whether it's exactly what Barth or Murdoch say, what we want to capture is this really robust account of love that captures your intuitions and all that. But then there's a separate sort of project of, okay, are these two actually talking about the same thing? Are they, doing the exegetical work, engaging with them and interpreting them and saying exactly what's going on? And it sounds like maybe parts of Mike and Kay's responses to you were things like, well, the exegetical is wanting a bit, which, yeah, fair. That's all really hard. But so thinking about your project as more of this, let's get this account of love under consideration and think about it and use Bart and Murdoch as the sort of initial starting points to get it off the ground and as like case studies for thinking about it. I guess, are there ways where you feel like Murdoch and Bart's discussion of love are overly restricting what you actually ultimately want to say as your account of love, or have I captured kind of methodologically what you're wanting to do? What are your
Yeah,
thoughts?
no, I think that's great and really helpful. And definitely, if I want to change this paper in any fundamental way, the temptation is definitely just like ditch the Murdoch, because I'm not sure I completely understand it, and I'm also not sure that her view matches up with Bart's in the way that would be needed to make it work. I am very attached to this idea of like holding on to the Bart stuff, but yeah, it's definitely plays the role that you suggest it plays, which is I'm not starting from here are these books that I've read, what are these people trying to say? I'm starting from here's something I want to say about love, and I want to use these people to do it. And in particular, I just mentioned earlier, but I might just flesh it out a bit more in case it's of interest. So have any of you seen the film Portrait of a Lady on Fire? It's like this like French art house historical lesbian movie from about 2019, and it's so good. But the characters at one point in it have a discussion about like the myth of Orpheus, right? And they're asking, why does Orpheus turn back to look at Eurydice when they're sort of leaving the underworld? And the first person says, well, like he loves her, he just can't like resist it any longer. But they say, well, that doesn't make any sense, because he knows that by turning to look at her, that she's going to be sent back to the underworld, and that's going to be it for their relationship. So then one of them makes the suggestion, well, quote, maybe he doesn't make the lover's choice, but the poet's, right? And the idea is the poet is someone who like values above all the image of someone, right? Because they can make art out of it. Whereas the lover, by contrast, therefore, is like not so invested in like the image of someone or like their image of that person. They might have no image at all, right? Orpheus is looking ahead, Eurydice is behind, but anyway. And so I wanted to make sense of like this suggestion in this film and tie that. And I sort of thought that the Bart might be a useful way to do that, because he also has this concern with like images, basically. But then I was looking around for a way to tie this into like more recognizable conventional like Anglophone literature. And the Murdoch seems the closest, but I think the way to go might be start with just like the more everyday thought that like loving someone involves like getting to know them in some sense, and just like push back on that without, and then I don't need to worry about like Platonism, which is big and scary and I don't understand and is not my, and I'm definitely like epistemically trespassing, right? So yeah, no, I think that's helpful. Thank you.
More questions? So much to chew on. Yes, Cassie, you're very much right about that.
Thanks for the comments in the chat as well. It's
yes, if you like, you can also reply to these as long as we as long as we don't have any other questions in the queue. So if you want, feel free to comment on the chat, Nick.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I have particular thoughts at the moment, but it is something to think more about.
In that case, okay. Well, we have a couple of minutes left and no questions, so I would offer you the opportunity to give a closing remark if you like.
I don't think I have much more to say other than thanks for all the questions. It's really helped clarify this project, which is sort of new territory for me, because as Kate mentioned at the start, my day job is thinking about like epistemic injustice. So this is it's all new, straying into thinking about love, and it's really helped me get a better picture of where I could take it going forward. So thanks everyone.
Thank
Thank you
you
so
very much, Nick, for presenting today. So this closes our colloquium talk. I thank everyone for the contributions to the discussion, and we will meet in a bit more than half an hour again. Thank you all.
Yeah, come back at 3 Pacific time, 35 minutes for the Helen de Cruz Wonder Award recognition ceremony sort of thing. So we'll all see you then. You're welcome to hang out and chat more now. But I think a lot of us also could use some looking at things other than screens for a little bit.
There are many tweetable moments from today's talks. Lesbians greater than Plato, probably my favorite. Why not?
I support it. How are you holding up, Jay? Feeling good?
Yeah. It's a good day. Probably gonna walk to get ice cream in town because the ice cream place opened up. Woohoo! That's our
That's
plan.
fabulous.
Listen, if Aristotle is on team lesbian, then we should all be on team Aristotle. It's just true.
I'm sure he probably isn't, but
It's true.
I feel like there's so many things from today that now I've just been reeling around in my head. What do they all mean? Gotta go read more Murdoch.
I have to go read more ... everything.
That's the takeaway from any conference, right?
Mm-hmm.
I need to read more stuff.
Ooh, yes. Thank you for dropping Rena's red bubble.
Legendary philosopher art shirts.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a tenure track job yet, but should that ever happen, I feel like I could wear more of the shirts on the list. But I still feel like I have to pick the one that I'm allowed to wear while still in that state.
I hadn't seen all of these.
Yeah, the list grows. It's fantastic.
Babes for Beauvoir. These are amazing. I'll also plug Rebecca. It'll come to me. Hold on. Ferreira has a line of philosophy merch also that's been fantastic, as well as our very own Kelly.
Kelly
Right.
Ryan.
What?
Kelly Ryan. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome philosophy merch lines.
Gotta drop those names so I can Google them. Oh, unread message. Okay, cool. Good.
Yeah, start promoting your local philosopher artist.
Well, someone has to pay for our scholarship. ... That looks dope. Philosophy wear. Let's go.
Seems like we need to have a separate part of CogTweeto website that's just like cool merch places to get, since CogTweeto merch is up and coming, and
Mm-hmm. Think about
merch-
the future. It's imagination. Mm-hmm.
I know
It-
you. I've got a bunch of CogWeirdo cups that people can have if they want them. Maybe
You
they'll be
mean
like
you
vintage.
limited edition?
Limited edition CogWeirdo mugs. Thank you.
There we go. Yeah, for a yearly subscription to our Patreon at in 6-month intervals, we can send you one cup.
That
You
says
can opt out of that if you're a true
CogWeirdo
hero.
Halloween 2021.
Yeah, well, that was the
Be-
time to beat. We had a costume contest won by everyone's favorite Renee,
Mhm.
if I remember correctly.
No, I think Luke Roloffs won that one with
Listen.
their Yzma costume, I think.
yeah, I was
Fake
thinking
news, fake news, fake news.
overall winner was Luke Roloffs, and then
Hello.
I'm not in a brilliant shape, as you could see. Like, actually, if it weren't the American healthcare system, I would still be in the hospital, but now they just want to free up beds.
It's
Oh
true.
my God. Yeah, anyway. So imagine
So-
that I'm well dressed and coiffed and whatever, and not this sorry bundle of, well,
No, we're all just floating heads.
Fantastic.
yeah, that's the magic of Zoom, is that like 90% of your presence is not visible. So it's a lot easier to come across as very put together, even when you're wearing sweatpants or no pants or whatever kind of pants. And
Mhm, mhm.
we're so glad you could make it.
Yep. Just to let everyone know, we'll keep the vibes. I know it'll be very exciting. It's CogTweeto's first serious award like this, but we'll keep the tone, honorific but chill. We'll spread the love, but keep ourselves together so that we're not too exciting. That's the plan.
Something
Thanks
I
for
am
joining us.
mildly excited about is that if you do this, Zoom picks it up. It says love. Or if you have the updated Zoom anyway.
My heart breaks
feel
for my lack of
I
updated
feel
Zoom.
cheated. Come on, this is so geometric. No.
Probably
Jen, you
need
have to do
the
all.
most recent version of Zoom, right?
Yeah. I actually was really put off by it because I was like, I gave somebody a thumbs up and it like did it for him. I was like, why are you censoring me? And it apparently can sense me. I don't like it.
It is weird. If you ever use the like an Apple camera, it actually has face tracking in it. So if you try and move away, it'll follow you, which sometimes is cool. But in many cases, like you're just walking by your tablet and it's just like, hey, no, leave me alone.
Yeah.
Sure. Welcome everyone to the first of its kind award ceremony for this CogTweeto workshop series. My name's Jay, and I'll be your host for this series. We put out a special call to create an award in honor of the philosopher and mentor and inspiration, Helen Cruz. And so the basic info we have, and I've got some things written up, so I'll go back on script whenever I switch tabs, is we'll spend a little bit of time introducing the award, contextualizing it a little bit, and then going through some submissions that we have from many philosophers or others who have seen this call and submitted things to say about the impacts that this wonderful person, Helen Cruz, has had on our lives, and why it is that we're kicking off. We'll call it an annual award, but we'll say a regular honoring of others called the Helen Cruz Wonder Award. So thank you so much for joining us for the first ever Helen Cruz Wonder Award, but surely not the last. Cool. I'm going to switch over to my script so we can get started. Does that sound good? Okay, cool. I guess I'm in charge, so I probably shouldn't ask what other I should be doing. I should know what I'm doing. Be confident. Cool. Got it. Okay. Like I just said, welcome. We are here to honor Professor Helen de Cruz with an award in their name. For those who don't know them, Helen holds the Dartmouth Chair in the Humanities at St. Louis University. They're the author of, hold on, I have copies of Wonderstruck, as well as several other things. A book which I don't have, Religious Disagreement, and an edited and illustrated philosophy illustrated book, which I also have. In addition to earning a PhD in philosophy, Professor de Cruz holds a PhD in archaeology and art science as well. In their spare time, they play the Renaissance lute and arch lute, of which many of you are probably familiar. They write fiction, draw, and paint. Their fiction has appeared in many wonderful places. You can see their website, it's all listed there. And they're a co-editor with other famous cool philosophers in an anthology, Philosophy Through Science Fiction, which is actually one of the topics that brought them into the fold of CogSweeto last time we were here. So I've got some sappy wonderings about Professor de Cruz and how this award came to be, so please indulge me. First and foremost, thank you, Professor, for lighting a fire that we, the wanderers of philosophy, can see. Your creativity, courage, persistence, and mentorship have profound impacts on all of us. Thanks for stirring things up and for reminding us that religion is not off limits, that there are other possible futures than those found doom scrolling, and for inspiring us to take risks and have hope despite everything. So I have a little bit of context sort of honing in on this award a little bit. So talking a little bit about Professor de Cruz's work, this most recent work on wonder and awe as sort of primary concepts in philosophy, Wonderstruck builds from an uncommon reading of Descartes and rightly questions the many common misreadings of Cartesian ideas. As a considered anti-Cartesian myself, I look forward to being challenged and inspired by this work for years to come. In some ways, this basic relation is indicative of my view of Professor de Cruz as a scholar, and one reason we come together to create this award, one reason we did this. I think philosophers are often prone to write more or less blandly about profound ideas until they lose all their spark and realness. We often exhaust them. In my experience, the best philosophers among us have found a way around this. I see Professor de Cruz's work as breaking out of these kinds of norms that plague our discipline by taking risks, both by encouraging re-engaging with canonical figures like Descartes and the many Rene haters, and a casual and thoughtful engagement with non-canonical ones. While many of us find the demand for an expansion of philosophical canon convincing, we usually struggle to do anything about it in our own work. It's hard, and doubly so in this world where there's little support in philosophical training for this kind of growth. I actually have a background in what is often called East-West comparative philosophy out of the University of Hawaii. And I think that even in that world where the comparison and East-West canon breaking is the norm, the sort of methodology is changing. In a relatively recent work, there have been proposals of this notion of fusion philosophy, or taking comparison outside of one versus the other. And it involves something like defamiliarizing ourselves with canon domination and becoming familiar with sort of a responsible history of thought, one that allows you to play across these boundaries. Ideas, I think, can be compared casually as philosophy, not merely artifacts that are defined from different unique traditions. Instead of, in order not to be canceled, we should think about Taoism or include a couple of lines about African philosophy. Instead, we should include philosophers who have relevant things to say. We should play with their ideas. I think this requires a casual kind of courage that I think we often overlook, and I don't think that we should. De Cruz's work is courageous and ahead of its time in this regard. They don't include Zhuangzi's butterfly in Philosophy Illustrated in order to meet some comparative quota, but because it's a powerful puzzle that provokes wonder. Doing so shapes the future of our discipline for the better. In fact, classes can be built around this book because it's accessible, and that's where these movements happen, by our choices as teachers. I think it centers wonder as a practice that can be invoked in various contexts. It also challenges us to engage in this canon-bending work too. We have to catch up. A work that includes hand drawing things from an edited volume, who can do that? Well, I guess we can now because it's already done.
We hear a lot that we should do this, but very few resources are created to show us how. Few mentors take the time and put in the energy to encourage us to be better than ourselves, to change the discipline. I think Professor De Cruz is such an exemplar and has already done this through their work and their advocacy. This award is not a one-off chance to call attention to a single inspirational person, that is Professor De Cruz. It's an enactment of formal recognition, a ritual if that's your thing. We created the Helen De Cruz Wonder Award to recognize the figures of our discipline who inspire us in their writing, mentorship, creative musings, and their ongoing practice. Professor De Cruz is the perfect candidate to receive this little indie organization's first such honor and an ideal figure to build such a tradition around. Please join me in sending some love to Professor De Cruz. And I would love to now kick us off into reading notes that people have submitted. But please, some of these will be read aloud by the submitters. Others will have others read them. And then some messages will also be submitted privately. In the event that you would like to participate in a way that is, you didn't already submit something, then you can, we'll open it up once we've gone through these submissions so that you can chime in via the chat and in this as well. So with that, I think thank you. I imagine a bunch of, I was on another tab, so hopefully a bunch of heart emojis happened. Heart emojis. Wonderful. Oh, good. Thanks, Jen. I appreciate you using the artificial intelligence for good here. Fantastic. So selfishly, my note came in first, so I'm going to just selfishly read it, and then I will call on Kay to read theirs, and then we'll follow from there. In the event that we find we run into a pause, I'll let anybody who wants to read them, who has access to the document, jump in, but we'll go off from there. So my submission. Professor De Cruz is an inspiration as a scholar, a creative, and an exemplary human being. I think they seem to have figured out something that most of us just write or talk about. They play, mentor, protect, represent, encourage, support, challenge, and have hope. When most of us cringe when we see one of our heroes commenting on some modern taboo, gender, religion, politics, sex, I don't know, pick one, we needn't do so with Professor De Cruz. They challenge us by engaging with these topics and somehow managing to keep themselves intact. They do this by teaching us. And I think they refuse to abandon us, especially those of us who find ourselves most alienated these days. And I think they do this all while living in what we consider, and probably many of us consider, the darkest of timelines and facing the worst of circumstances. So thank you. There's nothing else that I could, I'm overwhelmed with how many things that I could list in trying to appreciate about your work and what you do for our discipline. So thank you for all the wonder. That is mine. Kay, would you like to go next?
Yes, sure. So Professor De Cruz has been a continuous presence in my timeline, first on Twitter and then on Blue Sky for some years now. And during this time, I have come to admire their warmth, their sharp mind, and their firm moral outlook. Their engagement with neglected voices in the history of philosophy, I think, is a welcome disruption of a debate that is still too much dominated by the Western canon of philosophy. But importantly, more than that, I admire two other things I have come to associate with Professor De Cruz. Their enthusiasm for the arts, which shows itself in their wonderful videos of Renaissance lute plays and their drawings, and their relentless attempt to maintain hope in a world which seems to turn bleaker by the day. Their posts about how to hang on to optimism and the search for meaningfulness cast a light in the darkness of our times. Helen, I don't know why you choose to follow me back on Twitter all these years ago, but I am honored that you did. So Jen would be the next.
Thank you, Kay. If I just want to say something, I think this is the first time we meet sort of face to face. I don't know. Like, is that so? You think?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure. Like, we have interacted so much online, it's kind of interesting. So it was so great to it's great to meet you. And thank you.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you both. Thank you all. Don't know what to say.
Shall I jump in now? Cassie, do you want to start? So we were going to record this and we forgot. Should I do it now? Oh, whoa. Whew. Okay. All right. All right, back to our script. So for my part, it's difficult for me to express my gratitude to Professor Cruz for her consistent and vocal advocacy for marginalized voices in academic philosophy, especially as a woman, as a graduate student, and as a philosopher whose work has been impacted by disability and chronic illness in the wake of COVID-19. There have been multiple points that I've wondered if I was the right sort of person for a career in academic philosophy, or if academic philosophy was even something I wanted to have a career in. And Professor De Cruz has been a genuine difference-making figure for me as a model of the kind of philosopher I wanted and want to believe in, and the kind I'm determined to try and keep trying to be. So thank you.
So I will follow up next by saying that it seems like the norms of academic philosophy are insidious, as Jay mentioned, that it's easy to get swept away thinking that to do academic philosophy requires being a philosopher in a particular way. But I think what Professor De Cruz shows us is that you can be a sort of wonderful, rare kind of philosopher in the discipline who reminds us of all of the expansive ways that we can do philosophy, the ways that we can be philosophers, and how academic philosophy does not and should not limit what it means to be a philosopher. So I found that Professor De Cruz's has consistently inspired me to be more authentic, thoughtful, curious, charitable, and creative as a person and as a philosopher, and that those are deeply intertwined, not in problematic ways where academic philosophy limits you as a person, because that's what it is to be a philosopher, is to be this limited construct, but instead expands the role of philosophy in the world. So thank you for all of the inspiration in those capacities.
I guess it's my turn, and I'm literally zooming in from my car because I could not miss this. So Helen has been one of the most welcoming and open people that I've ever encountered in the discipline, especially given how hostile the discipline is and can be to junior scholars like myself. So their kindness and their consistent effort to remain kind and to be as supportive as a senior faculty member is something that I hope to emulate in my own practice in the discipline. And I cannot thank Helen enough for all the work that she's done.
I will be reading the next contribution, which is from Nathan Eric Dickman, who isn't here today. And he says, I've appreciated so much engaging with you, or at least lurking on your tweets about Spinoza specifically and philosophy more generally. I especially requested that your edited volume Philosophy Through Science Fiction Stories to be advertised on my back book cover when I published my first book with Bloomsbury in 2021. You've made professional philosophy better. We are ever grateful. Nathan Eric Dickman, fellow philosopher and Twitter mutual.
And I am reading on behalf of Bennett Gilbert, who also wanted to be here to read it on their own, but looks like not here. Just a quick note to say that Helen quickly became a friend I never met, always humanely warm.
The next one is from Mount Weiner. Actually, I've never said his last name out loud before. I am upset about that realization. Very weird Twitter fact. Where did there it is. So besides Helen's philosophical work, I find her fiction writing inspiring and am immensely grateful for the fiction workshop she organized for philosophers. Her decency and kindness have also shown through in person and more extraordinarily on social media, which is where I've most encountered her. And it's inspiring how she stands up for the right thing when so much of the senior philosophy establishment is at best indifferent to transphobia. medieval instrument playing always makes me happy when it comes across my feed.
The next note is from Hain. Would you like to read it yourself?
No, Hayne has a connection issue and has requested it to be read.
Okay, sorry. So Hain says, I have always admired Professor de Cruz's integrity, compassion, and intellectual curiosity. In addition to Professor de Cruz's inspiring efforts to make philosophy a more welcoming, respectful, and inclusive field, I am personally grateful for the many fascinating exchanges we have had about philosophy and music.
The next one is from ALG. Is that an acronym for somebody here? No. Okay. Helen is a wonderful person in so many ways, and she's the kind of philosopher I aspire to be. She does amazing public-facing and scholarly work. She engages with interdisciplinary themes. She works actively to encourage and prepare graduate students for the real world, and she finds inspiration in so many different corners of philosophy across time and space. Personally, I feel lucky to know her, and I always enjoy spending time with her when I get the chance. She's been a real support in the discipline over the years. And in short, I'm just pretty damn wonderstruck by Helen. I hope to see her again soon.
We have a note from a philosopher. Because of you, I read some Margaret Cavendish, and she's delightful. You're an inspiration in working on whatever calls your heart, which I didn't think was possible.
Next note is from Quill. Helen has taught me and continues to teach me that being outspoken and non-conformist is consistent with being unfailingly gentle and intellectually generous. This is a role model I need. I am deeply grateful for Helen's presence in the profession and in my circle.
Okay, the next one's from Remus. Most of my philosopher friends are also musicians, as I am myself, and Helen's lute videos were what first got my attention. Then I realized Helen is a role model in every sense, a keen intellect, unrelentingly kind to everyone who needs it, and a public philosopher in every sense. I came for the music, stayed for the philosophy.
Next note is from a Philosophers for Sustainability member who says, Helen de Cruz isn't the leader within the philosophy profession that we deserve, but they are absolutely a leader the profession needs. Besides doing excellent work in so many areas of philosophy, they've led efforts like the online APA meeting campaign to make our profession and the planet better. I want to be like them when I grow up.
Yeah, same. So the next one is a Substack reader and Blue Sky follower who writes, to discover Professor de Cruz on social media is really one of the best things that happened to me on there. I love their thoughtful and kind writings, how sincere they are in making philosophical thinking relevant for everyday life and everyday readers. And I love the things I learn about lute playing and lute music. Lots of love for the lute. To no one's surprise.
All right, and our last one that was pre-submitted that was asked to be read aloud at CogSweeto comes from a philosophy Twitter mutual saying, while I don't know Professor de Cruz well, my primary knowledge of them is through CogSweeto and Twitter, I want to express my appreciation for their commitment to thoughtful, careful engagement, not only with philosophers past, but with their contemporaries and burgeoning philosophers as well. In an online space that can so easily cultivate philosophical and personal vices, Professor de Cruz stands out as an exemplar of how philosophy can be done well. The discipline is better because of Professor Helen de Cruz. So at this point, we invite you all who are here to raise your hands and we can start a sort of queue for you all to share any additional thoughts you have or notes of appreciation for Professor de Cruz.
We had a note from Michael Smith who wished to say something.
Perfect.
Hi, hi, Helen. I'm an archaeologist, and I don't know much about philosophy. And Helen is a member of a small number of philosophers whose work I find interesting and useful. And most of the people in that category specialize in like philosophy of history or philosophy of archaeology. So she's the only philosopher out there who doesn't specialize in my field that I think does neat work. And she does have a background in archaeology and history, but still, I've enjoyed interacting with her partly on Twitter, and we had some email interactions for a while. And the fact that she plays the lute is extremely cool. I played classical guitar in my younger days, and I appreciate the lute videos. I really like them, and congratulations, Helen, and thanks a lot.
The lute's a big theme. Please, Emily, go ahead.
Thank you so much for having me. I am a little starstruck, I'll be very honest, with speaking with you, Professor DeCruz, but I wanted to say thank you so much for making space and making sure that otherness is not checked at the door. As a fellow person of color and philosophy and a femme presenting person in philosophy, it is really like your contributions mean so much, and they are fascinating and funny and really engaging, and just something that makes me feel like every time that sometimes I feel like I get kicked in the stomach for being here, it isn't worth feeling that way. And I want to say thank you for that. So again, thank you. And I really am so happy to be here for this.
Thank you so much for sharing. Does anybody else in the chat want to raise their hand to chime in? Please, Nick, go ahead.
Hi. I'd say I probably haven't engaged with Helen's work as much as some people here, but I just want to say I love their paper on prestige bias in philosophy, which I think is really important work, and just a general thank you for bringing the good vibes. And I'd have listened to a lot less lute music while I was scrolling if it wasn't for you. So thanks.
I have a brief reflection of the amount of playfulness in the sort of submissions, even the ones that will be submitted anonymously later or after this call. So it's a joy to have that be the established context at a philosophy workshop, and that your work, and as a part of someone who we've invited here, and you've been a part of the CogSweeto history, but that we see in your work, and we're so grateful that you're here with us, and that you're here to inspire us so that we can aspire toward. So it's cool to have the vibes recreated in real time. Thanks, everyone. Heart emojis all abound. Please, anyone else, if you would like to say anything, you are encouraged to do so. You obviously don't have to. We can just post a bunch of heart emojis and hang out. These are good vibes. So yeah. You have to, Carl, you have to have the updated Zoom, which means that you failed in your tech department area. So unfortunately, you have to use, most of us who don't have advanced computers have to click the actual heart button. Yikes. But yeah, this is just wonderful, and we're looking forward to formalizing this process so that you, Professor, will be our first recipient of the Helen DeCruz Wonder Award, but then others will have to aspire to your greatness in the future. So hopefully more lute players in the field. Otherwise, how are they going to keep up?
Don't worry, Jay, I'm aspiring.
Yeah, good luck. Me too. You think
You know
that's
how
going
to
to be
play
the
the lute?
first? Like, come on. You think this is going to be the first book that includes original art? All right, buddy. I got a stencil book.
Let's go.
Let's go. CogSweeto Intro to Philosophy. Cool. This concludes the structured portion of our award ceremony. We're not together in person, so I can't hand you an object, but I can hand you a metaphysical object, I suppose. Um,
Pretty
Can I just say
cool.
one additional thing?
Mm.
As I'm reflecting on CogWeirdo. So CogWeirdo was our first. This is a special edition workshop of CogSweeto. It is a themed workshop, and our first one was CogWeirdo, which was in Halloween 2021. And so we did, all things spooky and kind of Halloween themed for that workshop. And we invited Professor DeCruz to do our keynote. And I mean, to this day, I'm kind of like surprised you said yes to that invitation. And I'm like so pleased and like just happy that you did. And also we really we got a real boost to our like reputation as a little indie organization. We got the Helena Cruz APA bump for our event, which was kind of non-trivial. I think we gained like 1,000 followers from that. So anyway, thanks for just not just for your contribution to the discipline, which is immeasurable, but also to this initiative in particular. I mean, you just have made an invaluable impression on it, and the influence has in no small part helped us get where we are right now. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I actually don't know what to say, right? It's been I've been the past few weeks have been very, very difficult because of the illness. And very difficult. It wouldn't be easy to cure. The odds are not great, I'm telling you. But I don't want to be this like some sort of memorial while I'm alive. I'm gonna fight and come out of it. Because and it did make me think actually I did work really very hard. I put out a lot of stuff, but I worked very hard to do it. And I thought we should soul search a bit as a discipline, because lots of philosophers, particularly female philosophers, seem to be struck by cancer in their relatively young. And I just thought maybe it's my availability heuristic, but is there something so bad in the discipline that you're all saying oh, you help to make it better? And I often thought if you have a good attitude, you could do that. But there's a fundamental problem, right? That we shouldn't work ourselves to death, right? We should I mean, we should be able to be happy, right? So that's something I've been thinking about. So I'm planning to pulling out, and then I'm planning to help revolutionize the discipline so that we don't work ourselves to death. That's sort of my basic plan. So you're all in, right? And help me to realize that, right? There's something about the insidiousness, right? That it's never enough. I'm sorry, this sounds so very doomery, but it should be enough, right? What we do should be enough. So, we should, I don't know exactly how, but first I need to get better. And then I need to think about how can we, and it's not just prestige bias, it's the whole structure. It's just so rotten. So, yeah.
I think this, I'm sorry not to speak for everyone, but I think this is the ripe field to sow those seeds in. And I certainly would like to assist that.
Yeah, I think particularly young people or people who are early career, they can really push. People mid-career like me, it's difficult because you're in a sense, you have a conflict of interest, right? I have a named chair named for some guy who tries to privatize schools in Missouri. It's a bit morally injurious. They also make cat food. So it's sort of okay, it's the family that makes cat food. But they also try to privatize schools in Missouri, and they do all these horrible things. So there's almost an inevitable conflict of interest that I'm sort of trying to think about. The younger you are or the more early career, the less this is a problem.
Yeah, there's an unfortunate development towards institutionalization, where there aren't safe ways to be. My cat just did an acrobatics, so we're okay back there. But there's an institutional pull towards this strange political infighting or this stability, which is only achieved through, I don't know, ruthless backstabbing or trolly questions in the Q&A or some weird norms of things like this. So no, we gotta play around a little bit. And you're right, Professor, that this is not a living memorial, but a call to action, a call of recognition, a call to hold others to this standard and continue to provide them examples of what to do. Maybe a call to pick up an instrument, really, if you want to be cool. If you haven't
Yeah,
done it yet,
everybody.
do it again. Do it now.
Yeah, everybody should pick up an instrument. I don't know. Like
Yeah,
I'll
why
bring
not?
the bagpipes next time.
Okay, good.
bagpipes. Oh, that's wonderful. I love bagpipes. I used to live close to a park, and there was this guy who would practice every day at like 7 p.m. with such a
Amazing.
dedication, so you could know, like, oh, I feel a
So
bit down. I want
weirdly,
to.
that's the time you're supposed to practice. I don't know why, but like every
Yeah.
pipe band I've ever played with, that's the time we play.
Oh, well, I always thought if I
something
feel a bit down, I just go down to the park and listen to the bagpipe man.
Mhm.
And, yeah.
What park was this? Where was this?
This was in Ghent so I lived close to the Citadel Park. So my birth town is Ghent in Belgium, and it's a really beautiful park.
Mhm.
And you sometimes had musicians there. It's very nice.
Well, I'm happy to, if you're privately, I can connect you with a bagpipe band in your area if you would like to have that experience again.
I love bagpipes. Like, I don't know, something,
They're
I don't know.
nostalgic inducing. I don't know why. Nostalgia inducing.
Yes, but there's a sort of groundedness to them. Like, I mean, if you have the Irish flute, it's sort of a bit ethereal, a bit too ethereal. I'm sorry, I'm going to chase all the Irish flute players away now, but I think bagpipes have something grounded to them. Here
Yeah,
I go, all Brigadoon. Did anybody see that movie? It's really so funny. Yeah,
Amazingly fun times.
yeah. Mm.
Also just want to highlight something that's Jay said and that others have talked about, but I think what's been really inspiring for me, Helen, is that you do so many different things, and not just in the way of wow, you work so hard and you've done so much. How do you do it all? Sort of toxic productivity sort of sense, but instead more of just no, you can be a philosopher and also you can play lute and also you can get a PhD in archaeology and also you can contain multitudes, and all of that can be integrated in the work you're doing in philosophy, and there can be play throughout all of it. It doesn't need to be this really narrow, strict, formal way of life. And that's I think what we need more of, and that's hopefully also what a lot of CogSweeto is trying to bring is more philosophy for the sake of philosophy and in less formal ways and against some of these really strict hierarchies and formal structures. So thank you for that.
We're so good at making ourselves miserable. I don't know why that is. Like, as academics, right? You follow this great dream. It's so difficult, it costs so much, and then you're just miserable once you get it. Like, I've been really happy in many respects, I think. But in other respects, there is this kind of constant, how to put it, imposter syndrome. Like, like my first thought when I got the diagnosis and, outlook, and I was looking very brilliant, but still fightable, was, oh no, I've accomplished nothing. Like, it was like my first thought, and it's so weird. Like, how can you think that, right? It's just not rational. But I think it's just sort of exemplary for, how academia is. That would be your first thought. So anyway,
Well, we really appreciate you
oh,
making time to come hang out with us live. Even though we were planning, we had a backup plan to record it and send you a long and mushy message, which we'll now have recorded most of. So we've got some sort of artifact, but
It's actually been redundantly recorded, so
oh, good.
redundantly, that's good. Yeah, I really, really appreciate this. Like, I think if I'd been fully healthy, I would probably have declined because it sort of feels a bit cringe. But now I don't know. Like it's I don't know. Right, this is a lot to deal with, and I can use some things to make me feel a bit happier. Yeah. So that's why I didn't decline it. And I think it's also nice that we can like do it moving forward. And I'm really, really keen to see who the next recipients will be. Like, because if you look at prizes, like, and usually they have a nice, they're big prizes with money, and you give to like Martha Nussbaum and Peter Singer, who have specific ways of standing in the world, of course. I'm good at. I mean, there's nothing wrong with like Martha Nussbaum and Peter Singer, but like, why do they need another award, right? Like, and there's so many people like toiling, like they're great mentors, they're wonderful teachers. They write books that are great, but like nobody seems to care, right? So like it's very demotivating. So I like your idea. So I hope that prize is not going to go to like, even though I love them with all my heart, people like Peter Singer and Martin Nussbaum, but like, people who make this impact. So that I look forward to that, seeing that.
Yeah, we do too.
Mhm.
I think it's I solemnly swear it will not go to Peter Singer. I won't say why, but yeah. Specifically maybe. Other people maybe, but not so much.
No.
But indeed, when we were talking about this, the things we were talking about were this kind of award isn't like other ones, right? We're trying to pay attention to this philosophers as humans, which I think lines up a little bit with what Cass was saying. We're not a fan of you just because you're talented, but showing us that even though we are mostly barely getting through the very, very little philosophy, like the successes and the paths that we have through graduate school into whatever jobs exist, and fighting to death to be awarded little, and maybe barely having hobbies or barely having relationships or barely keeping rent paid, you're playing loot, you asshole, right? And so we're like, damn, that's cool. Maybe I can like, I don't know, are publishing an introductory work with drawings of your own? These are fantastic. Why would I want to do that?
Yeah,
Fuck
and we should.
writing some bullshit. Like
You
let's
should,
do
yeah.
that.
Yeah, I think genuinely, yeah, like you should. Like I think there should be more picture books in philosophy.
I'm in.
Yeah.
Let's do
Yeah.
it. So
Yeah.
I wholeheartedly agree. So who knows? I'm excited to see what other kinds of jerks who inspire us will be nominated, and the kind of discussion we'll have about how positive impacts they have on our lives as humans, not just as, I don't know, people who can dot their P's and Q's.
Yeah.
I'll put a plug in on that note that if people have nominations for future Helen de Cruz Wander Award recipients, don't hesitate to reach out to us either Twitter, you can DM CogSweeto, or email us at cogtweetoworkshops@gmail.com. We're working on kind of the formal nomination process and what that will look like moving forward. But in the meantime, if you have people you know of who think would be worth recognizing and as wonderful people and wonderful philosophers, send them our way, and we can start compiling lists. And nothing else, we can have sort of running list of like the anti-lighter report, where it's just like, hey, folks who have been really highly appreciated for themselves as people and for their work in philosophy, in case you want to check out what they're doing.
Oh, you're still muted, I'm afraid.
This is my healthcare provider. I'll need to pick this up.
Okay, no problem at all.
Hello?
Good.
At some point once we figure out our process, I'll like update the website with a more formal nomination portal. But
yeah, Emily, what's up?
Thanks, guys. So for nominations, is it someone who has to be formally in philosophy, or can it be someone who has done philosophy in a public way but isn't necessarily like in academia? Okay, Cassie's nodding like duh.
Oh yeah, disciplinary borders are bullshit. So
Oh,
like,
great, fantastic.
Oh yeah, that's kind of our
Really
thing.
good
So
nomination. I've got somebody and I'm like, this dude needs to go recognized. So,
The notion of who counts as a philosopher.
well,
maybe
yeah, John Altman's been working in philosophy for like 12 years and has some really interesting things to say. And I think that, yeah, I'd be happy to nominate him. So, be cool.
excellent.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think it'll be really, really cool to push back against the norms in the field, which sometimes institutionally can be expanded, like, depending on how a government of like the APA is working or another major organization is working, you can start seeing initiatives. But these initiatives are often like, once you get a couple of people who are not Eric Fitzgable to be honored, then, then you're doing the right thing, or, whatever. Or it's like, you're not just honoring, Peter Singer, but then there are still awards that are specifically just for the Peter Singers of the world. Let's make our own. So we did.
I think that the way that I at least conceive of this award is, and why, Helen, you were such a obvious candidate for an inspiration for it and a namesake for it, is it's not just that you are an excellent philosopher, or that this award would go to an excellent philosopher or a philosopher who does other stuff, and where that is like other stuff in like, where it's like sort of carved away, like you turn the philosophy off and you go do the rest of the cool things in your life. I think something that you are to a lot of us is um just like a realization of the possibility that like there's lots of different ways to be a philosopher. And you're just sort of like the way that you've like actively changed the landscape of like what it means to be a philosopher, not just to do philosophy, to be a philosopher, to pursue other things in a way that pursues wonder and sees wonder and cares about inspiring it in others. It's not just like formally or even like consciously unyoked from like disciplinary structures and stuff, but just like it comes from the heart in a way that it's like, impossible to fake. And it's like super palpable, and obviously all of us are feeling it too, but I think that you can tell when people act from a place of joy and a place of like love for what they do. And it's really, really cool to see a philosopher take that into public spaces, take that into their social world, and to share it with the rest of us. That's what we're looking for. That's the sort of figure I think we all see you as, Helen, but also the sort of figure we want to continue to recognize with this award.
$150%. And we just want to hang out with cool people. We want to direct people to cool people.
Also that, yeah.
So, thank you all for being here. Can I get a round of hearts for our recipient? And I believe if we look at the schedule, we have a little bit of time before we kind of have a social hangout time. So we might be entering into the we're not going to tell you what to do anymore phase of your life. And you have to think about taking responsibility for bathing and making sure you've eaten today. CogSweeto doesn't have that on the schedule. So.
It's a time for spontaneity, for freedom. Where's Nick?
Nick, get in here.
You know what I'm saying? I sort of started hearing sort of keywords. I'm like, oh.
Sorry, I was waiting for a pause and there never a good time.
It's always a good time to hear the robot voice tell us what to do.
It's gonna be
Thank you
great.
so
It's gonna be
much.
Nick going, yay!
I'm going to check out
It's been a
because
long day.
actually, like normally I should still be in hospital, but they like in the American healthcare system, they could kick you out like in 2 days when you're still sort of like floating on the anesthesia, which is philosophically interesting. Like, like I tried to switch off the philosophy, but I was like thinking, I don't remember a thing. Like I don't remember being on the operating table, and they were asking me questions there, and I was answering like, isn't that cool? like, that sort of thing. But actually I should, so I have limited bandwidth, but I'll be back. I'll be better. This will just take a little while to recover from. And thank you so much. I'm really very touched, so thanks.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Congratulations.
Yes, and we'll see you up and kicking and
Mm-hmm.
strong as and readier than ever to take on all the nonsense in the discipline.
That's right. Yeah, we start a revolution, 1789 philosophy edition. Okay, we'll see you all.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
See you, Helen.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you for coming.
Yes, thanks for joining us.
Are we just starting social hour now?
I think we can probably just transition into that and